Robert Moffat.
The missionary hero of Kuruman.
Written by David J. Dean. Originally published in 1880, slightly revised in 2024. Audiobook produced by scrollreader.com, reviving classical Christian books and missionary biographies with free audiobooks and reformatted reprints. Preface. The life story of Robert Moffat, the South African missionary, will always hold interest as long as people value noble deeds and patient effort. Our hearts will race and our enthusiasm will ignite as we read about the dangers he faced and overcame, the true courage he showed in confronting the king of beasts on the African plains, and the time he spent with savage chiefs, beneath whose warriors' spears and clubs thousands had perished. Our sympathy is stirred by tales of sickness and suffering, hunger and terrible thirst, and ongoing disappointments that lasted for years. Gratitude brings tears to our eyes as we witness the love driving the effort to bring the heathen to the Saviour, and as we see the once darkened souls clothed and subdued, learning the truth of the gospel in both mind and heart. We are grateful for heroic Christian men like Moffat, who hold nothing dear, not even their lives, in their mission to win sinners to the love of Jesus Christ. Such a man was he whose memoir we now present to our readers, with the sincere hope that his strong faith may strengthen ours, that his quiet courage may inspire us to persevere in doing good, and that his deliverance from many real dangers may lead us to trust in the one whom Moffat trusted, who never abandons those who trust in him. May we all, especially the youth of our land, see through the records of such noble lives that true godliness does not diminish true manhood, but rather glorifies and ennobles it, until evil is overcome and the wicked are silenced. In writing this brief sketch of the life of the Reverend Dr. Moffat, the author has drawn heavily from those who have written before him, particularly the well-known works Robert and Mary Moffat, by their son John S. Moffat, and Robert Moffat's own book, Missionary Labours and Scenes in South Africa. The author also acknowledges the Missionary magazine, the Chronicle of the London Missionary Society, reports from various missionary societies, a life's labours in South Africa, and other works that provided information on the subject. For those seeking more detailed accounts, the author especially recommends the first two sources mentioned. Chapter 1. Pioneer Missions in South Africa. The history of missions in South Africa is filled with fascinating stories and events. Tales of heroism, unusual adventures, and journeys among savage tribes and lands filled with wild animals are part of its narrative. The central theme is love for God and love for humanity, brought to life by the efforts of noble and dedicated men and women to introduce their African brothers and sisters to Jesus Christ. Many names are revered in connection with these missions, belonging to those who worked faithfully on earth and have since gone to their reward. Among them, Robert Moffat stands out prominently. To better understand the work Robert Moffat carried out and the success he achieved, it is helpful to briefly look at the development of the Cape of Good Hope colony and the early efforts to evangelize the native peoples. This will also give some insight into the situation when Moffat first arrived in South Africa. The Portuguese discovered the Cape in 1486, but significant European colonization didn't begin until the mid-1600s. In 1652, the Dutch took possession of the bold and mountainous promontory of the Cape and established a settlement where Cape Town now stands. The first settlers were mainly Dutch and German farmers, later joined by French and Piedmontese Huguenots, who had been driven from their homelands for their religious beliefs. At this early stage, the entire area now known as the colony was inhabited by the Hottentots, a people with pale yellow-brown skin who were lighter in colour than the Kaffirs and Bechuanas. They were symmetrical in form when young, hardy, and had small hands and feet. The Hottentots were nomadic and, in their uncivilized state, practiced little agriculture. Their system of government was somewhat patriarchal, and they lived in kraals, or villages, consisting of beehive-shaped huts arranged in a circle. Their ideas of a deity were vague, and they had few religious ceremonies, though sorcerers held significant power among them. Depending on where they lived, they were known as Hottentots, Namakwas, or Koranas. As the European settlers increased in number, they gradually expanded northward and eastward, either driving the natives away or enslaving them. In 1806, the colony came under British control, and after a period of conflict, the Hottentots within British territory were emancipated. This act of justice occurred on July 17, 1828. In the early 1800s, the natives of South Africa included the Hottentots, who lived in the southern part of the country and were sparsely scattered to the northwest in Great Namakwaland. The Kaffirs lived in the southeast, beyond the Fish River. The Basutos had kraals south of the Orange River. The Bechuanas and related tribes lived north of the Orange River. And far to the northwest, beyond Namakwaland, were the Damara tribes, about whom little was known at that time. In addition, there were the Bushmen, a nomadic people small in stature and at the lowest level of barbarism. They were hunted by Dutch farmers like wild animals, with every man's hand turned against them and theirs against every man. The Moravians were the first to attempt to bring Christianity to the natives of South Africa. In 1737, George Schmidt, sent by the small Moravian church in Herrnhut, arrived in Cape Colony. He established a mission station at Genadendal, the Vale of Grace, then known as Bavian's Kloof, the Glen of Baboons, where he worked among the despised and oppressed Hottentots for 7 years with much success. However, his work faced considerable opposition and persecution. He gathered a small Christian community and started a school. But the Boers, or Dutch farmers, grew jealous of the black population receiving education. Schmidt was summoned to Holland and not allowed to return. 50 years passed before the Brethren could resume their work. In 1792, 3 humble Christian artisans restarted their mission at Genadendal. The British government's control of the colony provided security for their mission, which soon grew into a large settlement and became a centre of light and civilization for the surrounding area. In 1799, the London Missionary Society began its work in Cape Colony with 4 missionaries, soon joined by Dr. J.P. Vanderkemp, a native of Holland with rare talents and fearless courage. Vanderkemp had been a scholar, cavalry officer and physician, and for some years he was a skeptic. However, after his wife and child drowned and he narrowly escaped death, he was converted and began earnestly studying the Bible and Eastern languages. He became so proficient in these languages that it is said he had a fair knowledge of 16. Vanderkemp chose to work among the Kaffir tribes. In 1799, he travelled from Graaf Reinet, then the most distant colonial town and closest to the Kaffirs, to the headquarters of the tribe. Often in danger among those who viewed killing a white man as a noble act, he endured great hardship and deprivation to spread the gospel to the ignorant around him. However, by the end of 1800, due to a rebellion among the farmers and the generally unstable situation on the frontier, he was forced to abandon his mission. He worked among the Hottentots in the colony with great dedication, often facing hardship and danger, but he frequently saw God's blessings on his work. Eventually, the Hottentot mission was moved to Bethelsdorp, where it steadily progressed. The students quickly learned to read and write, and their ability to understand religious teachings was impressive, especially considering their usual indifference, lack of understanding, and reluctance to put in effort. Dr. Vanderkemp died in 1811, confidently expressing the assurance that all is well. While Dr. Vanderkemp headed toward Kafferland, 3 other missionaries, Kitchener, Kramer, and Edwards, travelled to the Zak River about 400 to 500 miles northeast of Cape Town. They started a mission for the Bushmen there, which didn't succeed in its original goal, but helped bring attention to the Namakwas, Kuranas, Griquas, and Bechuanas. This mission made these tribes and their conditions known to the Christian world. After moving to the Orange River at the invitation of a Griqua chief named Berend, the mission continued among the Kuranas, Namakwas, and mixed race groups. In 1804, it moved to Griqua town, where it became the Griqua mission led by Anderson and Kramer, and became a strong influence for good, lasting many years. Mr. Anderson described the Griquas' condition when he first lived among them.
They had no signs of civilization. Except for one woman, none of them wore any European clothing. Their poor appearance and habits could have made us dislike them if we weren't guided by principles that led us to pity them and strengthened our commitment to our mission. In many ways, they were little better than animals. It's true that we were with them at the risk of our lives. They lived by stealing from each other and didn't see any moral wrong in it or in any of their actions. Violent deaths were common. Their way of life was truly disgusting, and they had no sense of shame.
Despite these challenges, missionary work among them produced results. By 1809, the congregation in Griqua town included 800 people who lived near the mission for all or most of the year. The missionaries also worked among many groups of Kuranas and Bushmen. The land was cultivated, and fields of corn and barley replaced the desolation and barrenness. In 1810, a Kaffir group threatened to attack, but the danger was avoided through prayer. Mr. Jans, the only missionary there at the time, and the people set aside a day for special prayer, sent a peaceful message and a gift to the Kaffirs, who then withdrew. Peace replaced war, and the blessings of civilization followed the preaching of the gospel. The London Missionary Society also started a mission in Great Namakwaland, north of the Orange River on Africa's western coast. The area was described by someone who spent many years there.
Sir, you will find plenty of sand and stones, with a sparse population always suffering from a lack of water, on plains and hills scorched under the relentless sun.
The missionaries, after a difficult and painful journey, reached the Namakwas and stopped briefly at places they named Silent Hope and Happy Deliverance, before finally settling at Warmbath, about 100 miles west of Afrikaner's village. For a while, their work showed promise. Despite working in a weakening climate and lacking basic necessities, they tirelessly worked to improve the physical and spiritual lives of the natives. Their congregation grew to include Yaga, later known as Christian Afrikaner, a Hottentot outlaw who occasionally listened to the missionaries' teachings, and they visited his village in return. It was here that he first heard the gospel, later describing his understanding at that time as seeing men as trees walking. Terrible trials soon came upon these dedicated missionaries. One of them, Abraham Albrecht, died, and Afrikaner, in a fit of anger, threatened to attack their station. The situation for the missionaries and their wives was extremely difficult. They were among a weak and fearful people, with almost no means of defense. The land around them was barren, with no mountains, valleys, or caves to hide in. They were under a burning sun on a hot plain, 200 miles away from any civilized settlements, separated by a harsh wilderness and the Orange River. They were in constant danger, with Afrikaner, a fierce enemy, ready to attack. For an entire month, they lived in constant fear, expecting the attack at any moment. They couldn't bear the thought of abandoning the people who were already suffering to become victims of someone who would show no mercy. At one point, they dug a square hole in the ground, about 6 feet deep, hoping to escape the bullets in case of an attack. They stayed in this pit for a week, covering it with the sail of a wagon to protect themselves from the scorching sun. Eventually, they moved north to the base of the Karas Mountains, but finding it impossible to settle, they returned to the colony. When Afrikaner reached the station and found it abandoned, he plundered it, taking anything he could find. One of his men later set fire to the houses and huts, temporarily ending the mission. After some time, the mission was restarted at a place south of the Orange River called Pella. Thus, missions in South Africa had begun, with stations established among the Hottentots and others. Good work had been done and the way was prepared. The field was large, but there were still very few workers. At the time when Vanderkemp passed away, a young boy was working as an apprentice to a Scottish gardener, waking up at 4 o'clock in the cold winter mornings and warming his hands by knocking them against the handle of his spade. He was going through a tough training, but this boy was being prepared to continue the work that Vanderkemp had started, though in a slightly different way, and to help fill the gap left by Vanderkemp's death. This boy's name was Robert Moffat. Chapter 2: Childhood and Youth. Robert Moffat was born on December 21st, 1795. His parents lived in Ormiston, East Lothian, Scotland. They were deeply religious, with a mother who, despite her strict faith, had a loving heart. She taught her children to love God and learn the Bible from a young age. Not much is known about Robert's early childhood. In 1797, his father got a job at the Custom House in Portsoy, and by 1806 the family lived in Carronshaw, near the Firth of Forth. The family included 4 sons, 2 daughters, and Robert. Glimpse into their home during long winter evenings shows how a mother's gentle influence can plant seeds that grow into lasting faith. The boys would sit by the fire, learning to knit and sew, while their mother, who was very interested in missionary work, read to them about the efforts and struggles of missionaries, especially the Moravians in Greenland and the East Indies. Robert didn't have many educational opportunities when he was young. His first teacher was the local schoolmaster, Woolley Mitchell, and his first textbook was the Shorter Catechism, which included the alphabet. He was a slow learner and often got punished for it. Living near ships, Robert was more interested in sailing than studying. So he ran off to sea. The ship's captain grew fond of him, and with his parents' permission, Robert went on several coastal voyages. After many close calls, he eventually left the sea, which made his parents very happy. At about 11 years old, Robert went with his older brother Alexander to Mr. Peyton's school in Falkirk. The school focused on writing and bookkeeping, but those who paid extra could learn astronomy and geography after hours. Alexander was one of these students, and Robert was allowed to stay in the large room while the class was going on. Robert said,
I felt strange wanting to know what the teacher was doing inside the circle, so I would carefully watch through any small gap I could find, listening closely to the explanations. The teacher never guessed that I could understand the planetary system. Whatever I didn't understand, my brother explained to me on our way home.
This is how Robert learned some astronomy. Robert Moffat stayed at this school for 6 months, which was the last school he ever attended. At around 14, Robert was apprenticed to a gardener named John Robertson, who was a fair but strict man living in Parkhill, Polmont. The work was tough and the food was scarce. During the cold Scottish winters, the boys had to start work as early as 4 in the morning, often hitting their knuckles against the spade handles to warm them up. Robert remained there until the end of 1812. Despite his hard work, he sometimes attended evening classes, trying to learn Latin and measurement. He also learned a bit about blacksmithing and became skilled enough to play the violin. He had a strong desire to learn about anything he encountered, which helped him later in life. When his apprenticeship ended in 1812, Robert got a job at Donnybristler, the estate of the Earl of Moray in Aberdour. There, he entertained his co-workers in the evenings by playing the violin, enjoyed athletic sports where he excelled, and became a skilled swimmer. He even saved a friend from drowning. He stayed at Donnybristol for about a year, and then at around 16, he found work as an assistant gardener for Mr. Lee at High Lee in Cheshire. While at Donnybristol, he was able to visit his parents often, But now the time had come for him to say goodbye. The parting scene between Robert and his mother has been described by him and appeared in the Bible Society's Gleanings for the Young. It is described as follows.
When we came within sight of the spot where we were to part, perhaps never again to meet in this world, she said,
"Now, my Robert, let us stand here for a few minutes, for I wish to ask one favour of you before we part, and I know you will not refuse to do what your mother asks."
"What is it, Mother?"
"Do promise me first that you will do what I am now going to ask, and I shall tell you."
"No, Mother, I cannot till you tell me what your wish is."
"Oh, Robert, can you think for a moment that I shall ask you, my son, to do anything that is not right? Do not I love you?"
"Yes, Mother, I know you do, but I do not like to make promises which I may not be able to fulfill." I kept my eyes fixed on the ground, silent as I tried to hold back my emotions. She sighed deeply. When I looked up, I saw the big tears rolling down the cheeks that used to press against mine. As soon as I could speak, I said, "Oh, Mother, ask what you will, and I shall do it."
"I only ask you whether you will read a chapter in the Bible every morning and another every evening."
I interrupted by saying, "Mother, you know I read my Bible."
"I know you do, but you do not read it regularly, or as a duty you owe to God its author."
And she added,
"And now I shall return home with a happy heart, inasmuch as you have promised to read the Scriptures daily. Oh, Robert, my son, read much in the New Testament. Read much in the Gospels, the blessed Gospels, then you cannot well go astray. If you pray, the Lord himself will teach you."
I parted from my beloved mother, now long gone to that mansion about which she loved to speak. I went on my way, and before long found myself among strangers. My charge was an important one for a youth, and though I had a strong body and a mind full of energy, it took all I had to keep up with the pace of my duties. I lived far from what are called the means of grace, and the Sabbaths were not always under my control. I met with none who seemed to make religion their main concern. I mingled, when I could, with the carefree and godless in what are considered innocent amusements, where I soon became popular, but I never forgot my promise to my mother.
After several delays, Robert Moffat finally arrived at High Lee on Saturday, December 26, 1813. He found himself in a warm and welcoming environment. The head gardener took a liking to him and soon entrusted him with a lot of responsibility, making his work heavy and demanding. Despite working nearly day and night, Robert still found time to study the books he could get. Mrs. Lee noticed him and lent him books, encouraging his studies. From a very young age, Robert had felt serious spiritual impressions on his heart. The earnest teachings of his minister, combined with his mother's guidance and prayers, left an impact that he could never forget. These feelings were now deepened, and the good seeds that had been planted began to grow. The Wesleyan Methodists had started a good work at High Lee, and a devout Methodist couple persuaded Robert to attend some of their meetings. He became aware of his sinful state and felt troubled, but after a long and difficult struggle, he found forgiveness, justification and peace through faith in Jesus Christ. From then on, he dedicated his life to serving the Lord. He energetically joined the society and work of his new friends, but in doing so, he lost the favour of Mr. and Mrs. Lee, who were disappointed that someone they cared so much for had become a Methodist, a group that was often despised at that time. At this point, Robert's future seemed bright, and a position of honour and comfort appeared to be within reach. However, the hopes of that time were not to be realised. Seemingly minor events can often change the entire direction of our lives, and a simple incident was about to transform Robert Moffat from a rising gardener into a beloved missionary. Here's how it happened. While at High Lee, Robert had to visit Warrington, a town about 6 miles away. One calm summer evening, he set off. The peacefulness of nature filled his mind with thoughts of God and admiration for his creation. As he entered the town, reflecting on his life with hope, he noticed a poster on a bridge. It announced a missionary meeting, to be led by the Reverend William Robbie of Manchester. Robert had never seen such an announcement before. He read the poster over and over, and as he did, memories of his mother's stories about Moravian missionaries in Greenland and Labrador, which he had forgotten for years, came back to him vividly. In that moment, his choice was made. His earthly prospects faded, and his only thought was,
How can I become a missionary?
many challenges seemed to stand between Robert and his new goal, but the same divine power that had placed this desire in his heart also prepared the way for its fulfillment. Shortly after this event, he visited Manchester to attend a Wesleyan conference. While there, with much hesitation and nervousness, he decided to knock on the door of Mr. Roby's house and ask for a meeting with him. He was shown into the parlour, and soon the man he had both hoped and feared to meet appeared.
He received me with great kindness,
Said Moffat.
listened to my simple story, took me by the hand, and told me to be of good courage.
Robert had his meeting with Mr. Roby, who promised to write to the directors of the London Missionary Society about him and let him know their response. In the meantime, Robert returned to his usual work. After a few weeks, Mr. Roby asked Robert to come back to Manchester. It was decided that Robert would work at a nursery garden owned by Mr. Smith in Darkened, which was close by, so he could study under Mr. Roby's guidance. Robert stayed there for about a year, visiting Mr. Roby once or twice a week. Mr. and Mrs. Smith were devout and kind people whose home was always open to ministers and ready for good works both locally and abroad. The Bible teaches, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." Robert's desire was to glorify God and spread his kingdom, and God was not only guiding his path, but also preparing a devoted partner to support him throughout his life's work. Mr. Smith had an only daughter named Mary, who was not only beautiful in appearance, but even more so in heart. She had been educated at the Moravian school in Fairfield and was known for her deep piety and strong support for missionary work. As Robert and Mary spent time together, their mutual respect grew into love. Mary, with her strong missionary spirit, was ready to join Robert in his calling as a young messenger of the gospel. However, it was determined that for a time, Robert would have to continue his journey alone. After nearly a year in Darkened, the directors accepted Robert's offer to serve as a missionary. He left Mr. Smith's employment and moved to Manchester to be closer to Mr. Roby for further studies. This period lasted only a few months, so Robert had limited formal training and educational opportunities. Time for his departure abroad was approaching quickly. He made a brief visit to his parents, whom he did not expect to see again, and then awaited his call to the mission field. On September 13th, 1816, after saying farewell to Mr. Roby, whose fatherly kindness he deeply appreciated, Robert left for London. While in the city, he visited the museum at the London Missionary Society's headquarters. In a letter to his parents about this visit, he wrote,
I spent some time exploring the museum, which has many fascinating items from China, Africa, the South Seas, and the West Indies. The sight was truly overwhelming. The wild animals looked terrifying, but what struck me most were the objects of pagan worship. It is heartbreaking to see my fellow humans bowing down to such frightening idols. Oh, if only I had 1,000 lives and bodies. I would devote them all to preaching Christ to these degraded yet beloved people.
With this passionate spirit, Robert prepared to embark on the work that lay ahead of him. Chapter 3. Departure for the Cape. The farewell service was held at Surrey Chapel on September 30th. 9 missionaries were commissioned, with 4 going to the South Seas, including John Williams, the future martyr of Eromanga, and 5 to South Africa. Initially, Robert Moffat was supposed to go with John Williams, but this plan was later changed. The missionaries bound for Africa set sail from Gravesend on October 18th, aboard the Alacrity, and arrived in Cape Town after a smooth voyage on January 13th, 1817. 2 members of the group were assigned to stations within the colony, while Moffat and Kitchingman were destined for Namaqualand. However, before they could begin their journey, they needed permission from the government, which was initially denied. While waiting in the colony, Moffat stayed with a Dutch farmer in a village called Stellenbosch, 36 miles from Cape Town. During this time, he learned Dutch, a skill that later proved invaluable as it allowed him to preach to the Boers and their native servants who spoke the language. He also joined the Reverend George Thorne of the Dutch Reformed Church on an evangelistic tour that lasted 6 weeks, during which they covered about 700 miles. After spending more time in Stellenbosch, Moffat visited Cape Town, where he gained practical knowledge and visited the military hospital. Many of the soldiers were Scottish, and Moffat had a deep affection for them, as his brother Alexander had gone to India as a soldier years before. Finally, the needed permission was granted, and Moffat and Kitchingman prepared for their journey. They purchased wagons, hired oxen, said their goodbyes, and on September 22, 1817, Mr. and Mrs. Kitchingman, Robert Moffat, and a missionary named Ebner, who had been with Afrikaner and was in Cape Town for supplies, set out for Namaqualand. The story of the Namaqualand mission was briefly covered in our introductory chapter. Although Afrikaner was an outlaw and feared by the farmers, he had a certain respect for the English. He once visited the missionaries before they moved to Warm Bath and said,
I love the English, for I have always heard that they are the friends of the poor black man.
He even sent his children to the missionaries for education. However, later events led him to destroy the mission station at Warm Bath, as mentioned earlier. The Reverend J. Campbell, during his first visit to Africa from 1812 to 1814, travelled across the interior of the continent to Namaqualand. Along his journey, he discovered that in every village he passed through, the name of Afrikaner struck fear into the hearts of the people. He later remarked that he and his group never were so afraid in their lives. While at Pella, where the mission station was located at the time, Mr. Campbell wrote a peaceable letter to Afrikaner, which persuaded the chieftain to accept a missionary at his kraal. Mr. Ebner was sent from Pella and had been working there for a short time before his visit to the Cape in 1817. Some progress was made. Afrikaner and his 2 brothers, David and Jacobus, were baptized, but the situation became increasingly challenging for the missionary. He lost influence among the people, and his property, as well as his life, were put in danger. Shortly after leaving Cape Town, Mr. Ebner parted ways with the Kitchingmans and Moffat, leaving them to continue their journey alone. The challenges of travelling in South Africa during those days are evident from the details of their journey. The phrase, "in perils oft," accurately describes the missionary's experience as he travelled mile after mile, often across desolate stretches of burning sand, suffering from hunger and thirst. At night, the howls of hyenas and the roars of lions disturbed his sleep, while bushmen, even more dangerous than the wild animals, hovered nearby, always ready to attack those who were weak and defenceless. As the travellers passed the boundaries of the colony, they received hospitality from farmers, but these farmers were highly skeptical about Afrikaner's conversion. Their predictions for the young missionary's fate were grim. One farmer claimed Afrikaner would use him as target practice for his sons, another said he would skin him to make a drum, and a third suggested he would turn his skull into a drinking cup. A kind, motherly woman, with tears in her eyes, bid Moffat farewell, saying,
Had you been an old man, it wouldn't have mattered much, as you would soon have died anyway. But you are young, and you're going to become a victim of that monster.
On one occasion, Moffat stopped at a farm owned by a wealthy and important Boer who had many slaves. Upon learning that Moffat was a missionary, the farmer warmly welcomed him and suggested they hold a service in the evening. Moffat agreed, and after supper the room was cleared, and the big Bible and psalm books were brought out as the family took their seats. Moffat inquired about the servants, asking,
May none of your servants come in?
Servants? What do you mean?
The farmer replied,
I mean the Hottentots. of whom I see so many on your farm.
Moffat explained.
Hottentots?
The man roared.
Are you here to preach to Hottentots? Go to the mountains and preach to the baboons. Or if you prefer, I'll fetch my dogs, and you can preach to them.
The missionary said no more, but began the service. Though he had planned to speak about the neglect of so great salvation, he quickly adapted to the situation presented by his rough host. He read the story of the Syrophoenician woman and chose as his text the words,
Truth, Lord, yet the dogs eat of the crumbs which fall from their master's table.
Moffat had not gone far in his sermon when the farmer interrupted him, saying,
Will the gentleman take a seat and wait a moment? He shall have the Hottentots.
True to his word, the farmer gathered the Hottentots, and the barn was soon crowded. The sermon was preached, and the astonished Hottentots dispersed. The farmer, clearly moved, said,
Who hardened your hammer to deal my head such a blow? I'll never object to the preaching of the gospel to Hottentots again.
After a difficult journey, during which Mr. Kitchingman and Moffat took turns driving the cattle and lost some to hyenas along the way, they arrived at By-Sondermide, where Mr. and Mrs. Kitchingman were stationed. Robert stayed there for a month, gaining valuable information from Mr. Schmellen, the missionary whom Mr. Kitchingman had come to replace, as he had been reassigned to Great Namaqualand, where he had previously served. Finally, after his oxen were rested, Robert Moffat bid farewell to Mr. and Mrs. Kitchingman, whose friendship he greatly valued, and set out with a guide and drivers for the oxen. Their path led through a largely trackless desert, and they travelled nearly the entire night through deep sand. In those days, travel was done in heavy, springless bullock wagons, with several spare oxen to account for potential losses. By morning, the oxen were so exhausted that they began to collapse from fatigue, forcing them to stop before finding water. The journey resumed the next day, but still no water was found. As it seemed likely that continuing in the same direction would result in their perishing from thirst, they changed course to the north. However, the experience was just as grueling. That night, they collapsed in exhaustion and extreme thirst. The next morning they rose early only to find the oxen too weak to move the wagon. Taking the oxen and a spade to a nearby mountain, they dug a large hole in the sand and eventually found a small amount of water. Though foul and resembling old bilge water from a ship, both men and oxen drank it eagerly. In the evening, as we prepared to yoke the oxen to the wagon, we discovered that most of them had run off towards By-Sondermide. With no time to lose, Moffat immediately sent the remaining oxen with 2 men to seek help from Mr. Bartlett at Pella while he stayed behind with the goods.
For 3 days,
He later recounted.
I stayed with my wagon driver on this scorching plain, with hardly a breath of wind. What little wind there was felt like it came from the mouth of an oven. We had only tufts of dry grass to make a small fire, or rather, a flame, and we needed very little because we had almost no food to cook. We saw no other humans, no antelope, not even a predator, though in the dead of night we occasionally heard the lions roar on the mountain. Finally, just as we were beginning to fear that the men had either perished or gotten lost, Mr. Bartlett arrived on horseback with 2 men. They had a quantity of mutton tied to their saddles. I cannot imagine an epicure gazing at a feast with half the delight that I felt looking at that mutton.
Fresh oxen, accustomed to the deep sand, brought the weary travellers to Pella, where Moffat stayed for a few days, greatly refreshed in both mind and body by the Christian kindness of Mr. and Mrs. Bartlett and the friendly attentions of the converted locals. Continuing his journey, Moffat reached the Orange River, where crossing was typically challenging. The native teacher from Warm Bath, who had come to Pella to guide Moffat to his village, led him to a ford near the village. The wagon and its contents were transported across the river on a fragile raft made of dry willow logs, a laborious and time-consuming process. After each journey, the raft had to be disassembled and the logs carried back by swimmers. Once all the goods were across, Moffat was asked to place himself on the raft. not entirely trusting its appearance and wanting to save the natives from extra trouble. He undressed, left his clothes to be taken across, and swam the river himself. The natives grew alarmed as he approached the middle of the current, and some of their best swimmers dove in to reach him, but in vain. When he emerged on the northern bank, one breathless swimmer exclaimed,
"Were you born in the great sea water?"
Robert Moffat arrived at Afrikaner's kraal on January 26, 1818, where he was warmly welcomed by Mr. Ebner. The chief, Christian Afrikaner, soon appeared and inquired if Moffat had been appointed by the directors in London. Upon receiving confirmation, he summoned several women, pointed to a spot of land, and instructed them to build a house for the missionary. Within half an hour, a simple structure resembling a beehive was completed. In this frail dwelling, made of sticks and native mats, Moffat lived for nearly 6 months, enduring scorching sun, drenching rain, and relentless wind. He often had to flee from clouds of dust, and the flimsy walls were no match for the occasional dog seeking shelter or a serpent coiling in a corner. On some nights, Moffat had to leap out of bed to save himself and his house from being crushed during the nocturnal brawls of roaming cattle. His diet consisted mostly of milk and dried meat until he could eventually grow a small amount of grain and garden vegetables. A few days after Moffat's arrival, Mr. Ebner departed, leaving the young missionary completely alone in a difficult and trying situation, stranded among a people who were highly suspicious, fiercely protective of their hard-won rights, and described by Mr. Ebner as sharp thorns. Moffat had no fellow Christian with whom to share the communion of saints, no one to turn to for counsel or advice. The land was barren and miserable. His salary was meagre, around £25 per year. There was no grain and consequently no bread, and no way to obtain any due to the lack of water for farming and the inability to send for supplies from the colony. These circumstances led Moffat to deep introspection, questioning whether he had truly sought to do and suffer the will of God, in whose service he had embarked. Reassured that he had not undertaken this mission without divine guidance, and hearing the still, small voice saying, "This is the way, walk ye in it," Moffat often poured out his soul among the granite rocks surrounding the station. There he experienced both sorrow and joy, sometimes playing and singing on a violin that once belonged to Christian Albrecht, often lifting his spirit with his mother's favourite hymn, "Awake my soul in joyful lays to sing the great Redeemer's praise." Moffat looked to God for help and guidance, and his heart was strengthened. This time the chief, Christian Afrikaner, was in a state of spiritual uncertainty, while his brother Titus, a man of reckless courage, was a fearsome example of ungodliness and a terror to most of the people at the station. However, after Moffat began his regular services, consisting of morning and evening worship, as well as several hours of schooling each day, the young missionary was encouraged to see the chief attending regularly. Although not a fluent reader, Afrikaner made the New Testament his constant companion, and a transformation became apparent to all. The man once feared as a lion became as gentle as a lamb, with the love of Jesus Christ filling his heart. The former firebrand, who had spread discord, enmity, and war among neighbouring tribes, was now willing to make any sacrifice to avoid conflict, and actively sought to bring peace to those at odds. Even Titus was subdued, and though he never made a profession of faith, he became a steadfast and unwavering friend to the missionary, often ministering to his needs.
"I hear what you say,"
Titus would reply when confronted with the truth.
"and I think I sometimes understand, but my heart will not feel."
2 other brothers of the chief, David and Jacobus, became believers and zealous supporters of the mission. The extreme heat inside the native house and the limited diet of milk and meat led Moffat to suffer a severe bout of bilious fever, which quickly progressed to delirium within 2 days. When consciousness returned, Moffat opened his eyes to see his attendant and Afrikaner sitting by his side, their eyes full of sympathy and tenderness. After taking some calomel, Moffat rapidly recovered and was soon back at his post. The place where Afrikaner dwelt was unsuitable for a permanent mission station due to the scarcity of water, so it was decided to journey northward in search of a region near the border of Damaraland, where fountains of water were reported to abound. However, the only available wagon was in poor condition, and there were no carpenters or blacksmiths at the station to repair it. Without the wagon, the journey could not proceed. After considering the situation, Moffat decided to undertake the repairs himself. To do so, he first needed a forge, which required bellows. The native bellows were inadequate for the task, so Moffat ingeniously crafted a pair using 2 goatskins and a circular piece of wood. These bellows had enough power to fan the fire and heat the iron. Using a blue granite stone as an anvil, a primitive pair of tongs, and a hammer repurposed for the task, he successfully repaired the wagon. He also fixed some gunlocks, which were just as essential for the journey as the wagon itself. The party that set out included Afrikaner, 3 of his brothers, and Moffat. They travelled through extremely barren land, and the expedition ultimately failed, forcing them to return home after a few weeks. Once back, Moffat resumed the school and mission services. With David and Jacobus Afrikaner now able to assist, Moffat was able to undertake more extensive itinerating visits than before. For these journeys, Titus generously gave Moffat his only horse. Previously, Moffat had ridden on a bullock with horns. A risky practice, as a stumble could have resulted in being impaled on the horns. These itinerating journeys were often fraught with hardships and dangers. Reflecting on one such journey, Moffat recalled,
After tying my Bible and hymn book in a blanket to the back of my saddle and taking a good draught of milk, I started with my interpreter, who rode upon an ox. We had our guns, but nothing in our purse or scrip except a pipe, some tobacco, and a tinderbox. After a hot day's ride to reach a village, the people would give us a draught of sweet milk. Then, old and young alike, would gather in a nook of the fold among the cattle to listen to my address on the great concerns of their soul salvation. I exhorted those who could read to others, and to try to teach them as well, promising them a reward in heaven, for I had none to give on earth. When the service was over, after taking another draught of milk and conversing more with the people, I would lay down on a mat to rest for the night. Sometimes a kind housewife would hang a bamboo container filled with milk on a forked stick near my head so that I could drink during the night if necessary.
On one occasion, Moffat slept on the ground near the hut where the principal man of the village and his wife were resting. During the night, he heard a noise that sounded like cattle breaking loose. In the morning, he mentioned this to his host, who replied,
"Oh, I was looking at the spoor this morning. It was the lion."
He added that a few nights earlier, a goat had been seized from the very spot where Moffat had slept. When Moffat asked why he had been put to sleep there, the man simply replied,
"Oh, the lion would not have the audacity to jump over on you."
Sometimes, after travelling all day with hopes of reaching a village by nightfall, Moffat and his companions would find the place deserted. Hungry and thirsty, they would have to spend the night there. In the morning, after searching for water and, if successful, taking a drink. They would continue their journey, hoping to catch up with the migrating villagers by evening. Guarding his everyday life during this time, Moffat said,
My food was milk and meat, living for weeks on one, then on the other, and sometimes on both together. All was well as long as I had either, but sometimes both failed, and there were no shops in the country where I could buy provisions, even if I had money, which I did not.
Moffat's wardrobe also reflected his poverty. The clothes he had received in London quickly wore out, and the sewing and knitting skills he had reluctantly learned from his mother often came in handy. His mother had once shown him how to smooth a shirt by folding it properly and hammering it with a piece of wood. Determined one day to have a neat shirt for the Sabbath, Moffat tried this technique. He carefully folded the shirt, laid it on a smooth granite block, and began hammering away. Afrikaner, noticing his activity, asked,
"What are you doing?"
Smoothing my shirt,
Moffat replied.
"That is one way."
Afrikaner commented. Indeed it was, for when Moffat held the shirt up to the light, he saw it was riddled with holes.
When I left the country,
Moffat recalled,
I didn't have half a dozen shirts with 2 sleeves apiece.
Robert Moffat's stay in Namaqualand lasted a little over 12 months. Towards the end of his time there, he made a journey to the Griqua country on Afrikaner's behalf to evaluate the suitability of a place for settlement. The journey was harrowing, with Moffat suffering from hunger, thirst, intense heat, and drinking poisoned water. When he finally reached Griqua town, he entered the house of Mr. Anderson, the missionary there, in a dire state, speechless, haggard, emaciated and drenched in sweat. Unable to speak, he communicated his need for water through gestures. Mr. Anderson and his household received him kindly, and after a few days of recovery, Moffat started back on the return journey. The trip back was nearly as difficult as the journey out, but he managed to reach Vriedberg, Afrikaner's village, safely. Afrikaner was completely satisfied with Moffat's report on the suitability of the land, but the relocation of his people was postponed for the time being. Back at the mission, Moffat resumed his work. The school flourished, and attendance at Sabbath services was very encouraging. The people had grown so attached to Moffat that he did not dare mention his plans to visit the Cape, fearing their reaction. In a letter from this period, Moffat described his daily life, highlighting the challenges of managing everything alone.
I have many difficulties to encounter, being alone. No one can do anything for me in my household affairs. I must attend to everything, which often confuses me and hinders my work, for I would wish to have almost nothing to do but instruct the heathen, both spiritually and temporally. Daily I do a little in the garden, and daily I mend guns for the people. I'm carpenter, smith, cooper, shoemaker, miller, baker, and housekeeper, the last being the most burdensome. An old Namakwa woman milks my cows, makes a fire, and washes. All other tasks I do myself, though I seldom prepare anything until driven by hunger. I drink plenty of milk, and often eat a piece of dry meat. Recently, I harvested nearly 2 bowls of wheat from 2 hatfuls I'd sown. This is a great help to me. Soon, I will have plenty of Indian corn, cabbages, melons, and potatoes. Water is scarce. I have sown wheat a second time as a trial. I live mainly on bread and milk now. Today, I churned about 3 Scotch pints of milk, yielding 2 pounds of butter, so you can imagine how rich the milk is. I often wish my mother could see me. My house is always clean, but there is such confusion among my linen.
In November 1818, Moffat received letters from England, one of which was from Miss Smith. In it, she expressed her deep regret that she had to abandon any hope of going abroad, as her father had firmly decided never to allow it. This was a severe trial for Moffat, but it only drew him closer to God, who in his own time would bring about what seemed impossible. Early in 1819, circumstances required Moffat to visit Cape Town. During a conversation with Afrikaner about the state and prospects of the mission, the idea suddenly occurred to Moffat that it might be beneficial for the chief to accompany him. When he suggested it, Afrikaner was astonished.
"I had thought you loved me,"
he said,
"and now you advise me to go to the government to be hung up as a spectacle of public justice."
Then, placing his hand on his head, he added,
"Do you not know that I am an outlaw and that 1,000 riksdollars have been offered for this poor head?"
After a while, Afrikaner responded to Moffat's arguments by saying,
"I shall deliberate and roll my way upon the Lord. I know he will not leave me."
Getting Afrikaner safely through the territories of the Dutch farmers to the Cape was a risky endeavour, as many had not forgotten the atrocities he had committed. and hatred for him still simmered in many hearts. However, they made the attempt, with Afrikaner disguised as one of Moffat's attendants. The chief wore one of Moffat's only 2 remaining substantial shirts, a pair of leather trousers, a worn duffel jacket, and an old hat of indeterminate colour. Moffat's own attire was scarcely more refined. As a whole, the Dutch farmers were kind and hospitable to strangers. When Moffat reached their farms, some congratulated him on returning alive, having believed that Afrikaner had long since murdered him. At one farm, a particularly amusing incident occurred. As they approached, Moffat instructed his men to take the wagon to the valley below, while he walked towards the house, which was situated on a hill. The farmer came out slowly to meet him. When Moffat stretched out his hand in greeting, the farmer hesitated, putting his hand behind his back, and asked who the stranger was. Moffat replied that he was Moffat.
Moffat?
Exclaimed the sturdy Boer in a faltering voice.
It is your ghost.
I'm no ghost,
Moffat replied calmly.
Don't come near me,
said the farmer, clearly shaken.
You were long since murdered by Afrikaner. Everyone says so, and a man even told me he saw your bones.
Worried that the supposed ghost might alarm his wife, the farmer and Moffat walked together back to the wagon, discussing Afrikaner along the way. Moffat expressed his belief that the chief had truly become a good man.
I can believe almost anything you say,
the Boer admitted.
But that I cannot credit.
Finally, the farmer concluded with earnestness.
Well, if what you say is true about that man, I have only one wish, to see him before I die. When you return, as sure as the sun is over our heads, I will go with you to see him, even though he killed my own uncle.
This farmer was a good man who had shown Moffat kindness on his journey to Namaqualand. Knowing the farmer's sincerity and good nature, Moffat turned to the man sitting by the wagon and, addressing the farmer, said,
This, then, is Afrikaner.
The Boer started, his eyes wide with shock, as if the man before him had fallen from the sky.
Are you Afrikaner?
He asked, incredulous. Afrikaner stood, removed his old hat, and with a polite bow replied,
I am.
The farmer was thunderstruck. Realizing the truth, he lifted his eyes and exclaimed,
O God, what a miracle of thy power! What cannot thy grace accomplish?
Upon reaching Cape Town, Moffat called on Lord Charles Somerset, the governor, and informed him that Afrikaner was in the town. The governor received the news with some skepticism, but scheduled a meeting for the following day. The next day, the governor met Afrikaner with great affability and kindness. He expressed his pleasure at seeing before him a man who had once been the scourge of the country and the terror of the border colonists. The governor was deeply impressed by this clear evidence of the success of missionary work and presented Afrikaner with an excellent wagon, valued at £80. Moffat's visit to the colony had 2 primary purposes: to secure supplies and to introduce Afrikaner to the colonial government. Having accomplished these tasks, Moffat intended to return to his mission. However, circumstances took an unexpected turn. While Moffat was in Cape Town, a deputation from the London Missionary Society, consisting of the Reverend J. Campbell and the Reverend Dr. Philip, was also present. These 2 gentlemen proposed that Moffat accompany them on visits to the missionary stations and eventually be appointed to the Sechwana mission. The proposal was surprising, but after careful consideration and with the full support of Afrikaner, who hoped to relocate his tribe near the new mission, Moffat accepted the offer. Afrikaner departed alone, generously offering to transport Moffat's books and a few newly purchased pieces of furniture to Lattakoo, the new station. 2 brothers in faith met once more on this earth at Lattakoo. However, the proposed relocation of Afrikaner's tribe never materialized, as Afrikaner passed away before the plan could be carried out. The final moments of this remarkable man were described by the Reverend J. Archbell, a Wesleyan missionary, in a letter to Dr. Philip dated March 14, 1823.
When Afrikaner sensed that his end was near, he gathered all the people together and gave them instructions for their future conduct. He said,
"We are no longer what we were, savages, but men professing to be taught according to the gospel. Let us then live accordingly. Live peaceably with all men if possible, and if it is not possible, consult those who are placed over you before engaging in anything. Remain together, as you have done since I have known you. Then, when the directors deem it fit to send you a missionary, you will be ready to receive him. Treat any teacher sent to you as one sent by God, for I have great hope that God will bless you in this respect after I am gone to heaven. I feel that I love God and that he has done much for me, of which I am entirely unworthy."
He added,
My former life is stained with blood, but Jesus Christ has pardoned me, and I am going to heaven. Oh, beware of falling into the same evils into which I have often led you, but seek God, and he will be found by you to guide you.
Shortly after this, Afrikaner passed away. Chapter 4. Marriage and Arrival at Lattakoo. Up until this time, Robert Moffat had carried out his mission work alone, without the support of a loving partner to cheer him in his efforts or to tenderly care for his needs. Yet, despite the distance, he was fondly remembered and earnestly prayed for, particularly by one noble Christian lady, Mary Smith. At just 23 years old, she had endured a severe inner struggle for 2.5 years, torn between her filial love and duty to her parents and her deep affection and sense of duty toward her missionary friend. When hope seemed all but lost, Mary's parents, who had been extremely pained by the thought of parting with their only daughter, finally saw so clearly that it was the Lord calling her to his work that they felt they could no longer hold her back. Resigning her into God's hands, they gave their blessing. As a result, after a brief stay in London and at Cowes on the Isle of Wight, where her genuine and exalted piety, zeal, and modest, affectionate manner won the hearts of all she met, Mary set sail for South Africa. She travelled aboard the sailing ship British Colony under the care of the Reverend R. Beck, a minister of the Dutch Church, and his wife. Meanwhile, Robert Moffat had left Cape Town with the deputation on their tour of inspection of the mission stations in the eastern part of the colony and in Kafferland. This journey required an absence of 12 months, during which time Robert expected his bride to arrive in South Africa. It was a test of faith, as it seemed difficult that she would have to land in a strange country with no familiar face to welcome her. Yet, for Moffat, duty always came before love. However, after visiting the line of stations in the eastern districts as far as Bethelsdorp, the party found their progress halted by war with the Kaffirs. They were forced to return to Cape Town, giving Moffat the unexpected joy of being able to meet his fiancée upon her arrival. Mary reached Cape Town safely, and on December 27th, 1819, the couple was happily united in marriage. They received each other as gifts from the Lord, and for over 50 years, through both trials and triumphs, their union remained strong and blessed. But Moffat had been appointed to the Sechwana mission station at Lattakoo, later known as Kuruman. Early in 1820, the missionary party, which included the Reverend John Campbell and the Moffats, set out for Lattakoo. The Dutch Missionary Society in Cape Town had made a feeble attempt to establish a mission to the Bechuanas as early as 1800, sending 2 missionaries, Edwards and Koch. However, the mission degenerated into a trading concern, and in 1805, the famous traveller Dr. Lichtenstein visited the Bechuanas, followed by Dr. Burchell in 1812. It wasn't until the visit of the Reverend J. Campbell that serious negotiations for a mission were entertained. Chief Motherby told Campbell,
"Send missionaries, and I will be a father to them."
In response, missionaries Evans and Hamilton left England in 1815 and arrived in Lattakoo the following year, full of hope. However, instead of receiving a warm welcome, they were repulsed and directed to settle at the Kuruman River, 30 miles away. Disheartened, they returned to Griqua Town. Mr. Evans gave up the mission, but a subsequent attempt by Messrs. Reed and Hamilton succeeded, and permission was granted for them to dwell with the chief and his people, giving the Sechwana mission its first real footing. In June 1817, the tribe under Chief Motheby moved to the Kuruman River, where the missionaries settled. When the Reverend J. Campbell returned to the colony, Mr. Reed accompanied him, leaving Mr. Hamilton alone in charge of the mission until Robert Moffat's arrival. The journey to Griqua Town was completed without major incident. The route initially passed through fertile valleys and picturesque mountain scenery, but soon gave way to the desolate Karoo Desert. Halfway through this barren landscape, they arrived at the site where the village of Beaufort West would later be built. There they were warmly received by Mr. Baird, a Scotchman who had recently been appointed as the magistrate. They safely crossed the Orange River, which often posed a significant barrier as the water was low at the time. A few days later they reached Griqua Town, where they paused before embarking on the final leg of their journey, 100 miles to Lattakoo. At this time, there was some uncertainty about whether the Moffats would be permitted by the colonial government to settle at Lattakoo, as consent had not yet been granted. Despite this, they proceeded in faith, trusting that the way would be opened. After a brief rest at Griqua Town, the party continued their journey and arrived at Lattakoo 5 days later. It was planned that Robert Moffat would take over from Mr. Reed and work alongside Mr. Hamilton in the mission. The new arrivals were introduced to Chief Motheby and were soon visited by a group of chiefs. Mary Moffat found the manner, appearance and dress of these natives fascinating. The entire missionary party stayed together for 3 weeks to settle the affairs of the mission. Then, the Reverend J. Campbell and Mr. Reed departed on a journey to visit the Bahurutsi, a tribe living nearly 200 miles northeast of Lattakoo. During this time, Moffat and his wife remained with Mr. Hamilton, allowing the new missionary to begin building relationships with the Sechwana chief and his people. After 2 months, the Reverend J. Campbell and Mr. Reed returned to Lattakoo. Following a short rest, all the missionaries, except Mr. Hamilton, set off westward along the Kuruman River to visit several Sechwana tribes scattered across the region. The natives, who had never seen white people before, were very curious about their visitors, particularly Mrs. Moffat and her dress. They were fascinated by the sight of the missionaries dining with knives, forks, plates, and various dishes, and they would sit for hours observing such scenes. As the party travelled, the word of life was preached to these natives by either Mr. Campbell or Robert Moffat. The missionaries were away from Lattakoo for a little over 2 weeks. Upon their return, they learned from Dr. Phillip that permission had still not been granted by the governor for the Moffats to settle there. This news was disheartening, and Robert and Mary had to return to Griqua Town, where they committed the matter into God's hands, patiently waiting for the time when he would open the way for them to begin the work they so deeply desired. Mr. Hamilton was once again left alone with only a Griqua assistant and a few Hottentots. Just before leaving Lattakoo, Robert Moffat had a final meeting with Afrikaner, who had safely brought the missionaries' cattle, property, books and furniture from Vredeburg. Everything was in good order, with special care having been given to the cattle and sheep during Moffat's long absence. This was the last time Moffat and Afrikaner saw each other. As the missionary party neared Griqua Town, they received the long-awaited news that permission had been granted for the Moffats to settle at Lattakoo. However, the affairs at Griqua Town were in disarray, so it was decided that they would stay there for a few months to help set things in order. During their stay, Mrs. Moffat fell seriously ill, and her life was in danger. However, her precious life was spared, and not only was she restored to health, but the couple was also blessed with a baby girl, whom they named Mary. This little girl would grow up to become the wife of the famous missionary doctor David Livingstone. Griqua Town, Robert and Mary Moffat bid farewell to the Reverend J. Campbell. Over the months they had spent together as fellow travellers, Campbell had become dear to them. He and Mr. Reed returned to the colony, but 20 years later the Moffats would meet Campbell again when they returned to their native land. In May 1821, the Moffats arrived at Lattakoo once more. Thus began a continuation of missionary struggles that severely tested their faith. However, these trials eventually led to triumphant rejoicing as they witnessed the people being brought to Christ and saw the once ignorant and degraded heathen becoming humble servants of the Lord, reading His word and obeying His commandments. When the Moffats first settled among the Bechuanas, they encountered a people with no concept of a God and no idolatrous practices. The Bechuanas saw little in the missionaries' customs that appealed to them more than their own ways, though they did acknowledge that the missionaries were a wiser and superior race. The Bechuanas practiced polygamy and viewed any change that might reduce their wives' roles with suspicion, as their wives were responsible for building houses, gathering firewood, tilling fields, and raising families. They were a thoroughly sensual people who could lie, rob, and murder without guilt as long as they were successful. For years, the missionaries laboured among such people without seeing any signs of spiritual fruit. Yet they continued with steadfast faith and persevering prayer until eventually the work of the Holy Spirit became evident. The strong arm of the Lord gathered many into His fold, and the missionaries saw the fruits of their labour. The Bechuana tribe with whom Robert Moffat worked was called the Batlaping, or Batlapis. The missionaries' patience was tested in those early days by numerous petty annoyances, which were frequent and often frustrating. The chief had given the missionaries a plot of land for a garden, and with great effort they managed to irrigate and cultivate it. However, the chief's wife and other women began encroaching on the garden, and to avoid conflict, the missionaries conceded the point. The corn they grew was often stolen, and their sheep were taken from the fold at night or driven away while grazing during the day. No tool or household item could be left unattended without disappearing. One day, Mr. Hamilton, who did not have a mill to grind corn, spent half a day grinding enough meal with 2 stones to make a loaf of bread that would last him, as he was alone at the time, for about 8 days. After kneading and baking his large loaf, he placed it on a shelf and went to the chapel. When he returned in the evening with a keen appetite, anticipating the enjoyment of his coarse homemade bread, he discovered that the loaf was gone. Someone had forced open the small window of his hut, climbed in, and stolen the bread. On another occasion, Mrs. Moffat, carrying her baby, humbly asked a woman to kindly leave the temporary kitchen so she could lock it up before heading to worship. The woman, instead of complying, grabbed a piece of wood and threatened to hurl it at Mrs. Moffat's head. Mrs. Moffat had to flee to the house of God, leaving the woman in possession of the kitchen, from which she would not hesitate to take anything she desired. A severe drought also struck, and when the rainmaker's efforts to bring rain failed, he blamed the white strangers, leading to fears that they might be driven away. However, the most difficult trial at this time came from the conduct of some Hottentots who had accompanied them from the Cape. Being new converts, they were weak and succumbed to the pressures of their environment, bringing shame upon the mission. Shortly after his arrival, Moffat thoroughly purged the small community, reducing the number of those who gathered at the Lord's table. This action, though difficult, served as a valuable lesson to the surrounding heathen and ultimately did good. There was a pervasive indifference among the Bechuanas to the teachings of the missionaries, unless these teachings were followed by some material benefit. In August 1822, Mary Moffat wrote,
"We have no prosperity in the work, not the least sign of good being done. The Bechuanas seem more careless than ever and seldom enter the church.
A little later, Robert Moffat himself echoed this sentiment in a letter.
They turn a deaf ear to the voice of love and treat with scorn the glorious doctrines of salvation. It is, however, pleasing to reflect that affairs in general wear a more hopeful aspect than when we came here. Several instances have proved that the people are determined to relinquish the barbarous system of commandos for stealing cattle. They have also dispensed with a rainmaker this season.
The Bushmen, a neighbouring group, had a particularly inhumane custom of abandoning the aged and helpless, leaving them to starve or be devoured by wild beasts. Additionally, if a mother died, it was common practice to bury her infants alongside her. During one of his journeys a few months before, Moffat encountered a group of Bushmen digging a grave for a woman who had left 2 children. Learning that they intended to bury the children with their mother's body, Moffat begged for their lives. The Bushmen relented and the children were given to him. These children, named Anne and Dickie, became part of the Moffat household for several years. Moffat understood the importance of learning the Bechuana's language, but he was discouraged by how slowly he was progressing. One day, feeling particularly down, he shared his frustration with his wife.
"Mary, this is really hard,"
she responded with calm determination.
It is hard, but don't lose heart. We will be rewarded in the end.
Moffat continued,
"But think, my dear, how long we've been preaching to these people, and still there's no result."
Mary, with her wisdom, replied,
The gospel hasn't been preached to them in their own language yet. They've only heard it through interpreters who don't fully understand or love the truth. We can't expect results until you can speak directly to them in their own language, so they can truly hear it in their hearts.
Encouraged by her words, Moffat devoted himself with renewed diligence to mastering the language. He soon recognized the drawbacks of preaching through interpreters when a sentence like,
"The salvation of the soul is a very important subject,"
was translated by one interpreter as, "The salvation of the soul is a very great sack," rendering the message completely unintelligible. To immerse himself in the language, Moffat made journeys among the tribes, distancing himself from the Dutch spoken at Lattakoo. He also undertook itinerating visits to surrounding villages every Sabbath, and sometimes ventured further afield. Yet, despite walking 4 to 5 miles to reach a village, he often found no one willing to listen to the gospel message. The only service that brought the missionaries any real comfort during this time was the Sabbath evening service held in Dutch for themselves and the 2 or 3 Hottentots and their families associated with the mission. The missionaries faced not only physical privations and discouragements, but also false accusations and threats to their lives. The area was suffering from a prolonged drought, and the local rainmaker had failed to bring any relief. The people began to blame the missionaries for the drought. At one point, it was believed that a bag of salt that Moffat had brought in his wagon had frightened away the rain. At another, it was the sound of the chapel bell. Tensions grew, and it seemed the natives had decided to expel the missionaries. One day, a chief and about a dozen of his attendants gathered under a large tree near Moffat's house while he was repairing a wagon. Sensing that something important was about to be communicated, Moffat called for Mr. Hamilton. The 2 men stood together, prepared to face whatever was coming. The chief, serving as the principal speaker, informed them that the people had decided that the missionaries must leave the country. He warned that if they continued to disregard previous threats, more violent measures would be taken to enforce this decision.
While the chief was speaking, he stood there, his spear quivering in his right hand. Mrs. Moffat, standing at the door of our cottage with our baby in her arms, watched the situation unfold, knowing it was a critical moment. We responded to the chief. "We have indeed been very reluctant to leave, and now we are more determined than ever to stay at our post. We pity you, for you do not know what you are doing. Yes, we have suffered, and it is true that the one we serve has instructed us in his word. When they persecute you in one city, flee to another. But although we have suffered, we do not consider what has been done to us by the people as persecution. We are prepared to expect such things from those who do not know any better. If you are resolved to rid yourselves of us, you will need to take stronger measures, for our hearts are with you. You may shed blood or burn us out. We know you will not harm our wives and children."
Then, throwing open his waistcoat, Moffat stood erect and fearless.
"Now then,"
he said,
"if you will, drive your spears into my heart. And when you have slain me, my companions will know that the time has come for them to leave."
The chief looked at his companions, then remarked with a significant shake of his head,
"These men must have 10 lives to be so fearless of death. There must be something in this immortality."
Moffat commented with a hint of irony.
The meeting broke up, and they left us, no doubt fully impressed with the idea that we were impractical men.
Chapter 5. The Mantatee Invasion. In March 1823, the Moffats had a second daughter, Anne. At that time, the Batlaping were uninterested in the gospel, but their hostility towards the missionaries had faded. But Moffat heard about a strong Sechwana tribe called the Bangwaketsi, led by Chief Makaba, who lived about 200 miles to the northeast. He planned to visit this chief and his people. For over a year, there had been rumors of a fierce and large group called the Mantatees, who were advancing from the east. To get more information about them and to visit Makaba, Moffat decided to undertake a journey to see the chief. He also wanted to establish friendly relations with Makaba, who could be a powerful and potentially dangerous leader. Additionally, he wished to study the language and learn about the tribe's locations, all with the ultimate goal of spreading the gospel among them. An invitation came from Makaba, making the way clear for the visit. However, Mothibi, a Sechwana chief, was strongly opposed to the journey and created many obstacles, though he stopped short of using force. Moffat had to start the journey with only a few men, as Mothibi's people were forbidden to accompany him. As they travelled, they kept hearing reports about the Mantatees. When they reached Nokaneng, about 20 miles from Lattakoo, they learned that the invaders had attacked a Sechwana tribe, the Barolongs, at Kunuana, about 100 miles away. Spies were sent out but returned with no clear information, so the journey continued. For 4 days, they travelled through a dry, pathless land until they reached a beautiful valley with pools of water and plenty of game. They stayed there for 2 days before preparing to continue to the Bangwaketsi. Just as they were about to leave, they learned from 2 natives that the Mantatees had attacked the Barolongs and had taken over a village behind the missionaries' group. No time was wasted. The group quickly retraced their steps and returned to Lattakoo with the alarming news. A public meeting was called, where Moffat shared all the information he had gathered. The enemy was large and powerful, having destroyed many towns of the Bakan tribes, killed many people, ruined Kuracheni, scattered the Barolongs, and were even rumoured to be cannibals. The news initially cast a gloom over everyone, and silence fell for a few minutes. Then Mothibi, speaking for the group, expressed gratitude that their missionary had been persistent in his journey, thus revealing the danger they faced. Moffat advised that since the Sechwanas were not strong enough to resist the fierce Mantatees, they should either flee to the colony or seek help from the Griquas. He volunteered to go to Griqua town to inform them and get assistance. The chief there, Andries Waterboer, had been educated by missionaries and had been set apart as a native teacher before becoming chief. Mr. Melville, a government agent, also lived in the town. Moffat safely reached Griqua town, and Waterboer promised to help the Sechwanas as soon as he could gather his forces. Moffat then returned to his station. 11 anxious days passed at Lattakoo, waiting for the Griquas to arrive. By the time they did, the enemy had reached Lattakoo, just 36 miles away. The Griqua force included about 100 horsemen armed with guns. Since it was rumoured that there were white men among the invaders, Moffat was asked to join the force because he knew some of the language and might be able to negotiate a treaty. He agreed, and Mr. Melville accompanied him. Before leaving, everyone gathered to pray for divine guidance and help. They asked for a blessing to prevent more bloodshed, and if violence was necessary, they prayed for protection in battle. The small force advanced to the Matloran River, about halfway to their destination where they camped for the night. Waterbour, Moffat, and a few others then rode ahead for about 4 hours before stopping for the night among some trees. At dawn, they continued until they saw the enemy. The Mantatees were divided into 2 groups. One occupied a town from which they had driven the inhabitants, and the other was on the hills to the left of the town. As the horsemen approached, they could see that they had been spotted, and among the masses of invaders, they saw war axes and brass ornaments glittering in the sun. As they rode closer, Moffat and Waterbour found a young woman from the Mantatees who was clearly starving. They gave her food and tobacco and sent her to her people with a message that the strangers wanted to talk, not fight. They also found an old man and a boy dying of hunger, whom they helped while in full view of the enemy. They tried everything to start a discussion with the Mantatees, but it was all in vain. They only responded with furious charges, showing their intent to attack. The entire day was spent like this. In the evening, Moffat left Waterbour and the scouts and rode back to meet with Mr. Melville and the other Griqua chiefs to find a way to prevent the terrible consequences of a battle. One of the Griqua chiefs, Cornelius Koch, insisted that Moffat take his best and strongest horse, an act of generosity that later saved Moffat's life. The next morning, the entire group was in motion before dawn. All the horsemen advanced to within about 150 yards of the enemy, hoping to intimidate them and start a conversation. Instead, the Mantatees charged forward with a terrifying howl, throwing their war clubs and javelins. As the attacks became more dangerous, Waterbour and his group began firing, and the battle quickly escalated. The Mantatees stubbornly held their ground, determined to fight rather than flee, even though they had the chance to escape. After 2.5 hours of fighting, the Griquas, running low on ammunition, moved forward to take the enemy's position. The Mantatees finally retreated, first heading west, but then turning toward the town when they were cut off. A fierce struggle ensued, but eventually in despair, the Mantatees fled in panic, pursued by the Griquas for about 8 miles. Shortly after the battle began, the Bechuanas, who had accompanied the Griquas, arrived and started shooting their poisoned arrows into the Mantatees. However, when a few Mantatee warriors turned on them, the Bechuanas fled in chaos, but once they saw the Mantatees retreat, they rushed to the battlefield like hungry wolves, looting and killing the wounded, as well as murdering women and children with their spears and battle axes. Moffat, being a missionary, did not participate in the fighting, but he stayed with the Griqua force for safety. When he saw the brutal actions of the Bechuanas, killing defenseless women and children, he focused on rescuing those fleeing in terror. Riding into the chaos, he was able to stop many Bechuanas from carrying out their violent acts. The women, realizing they were being shown mercy, sat down and exposed their breasts, crying out,
"I am a woman, I am a woman."
The men, however, refused to surrender and, even when badly wounded, continued to throw their spears and war axes at anyone who approached. While Moffat was helping the wounded, he nearly lost his life. He found himself trapped between a rocky hill and a group of the enemy, with only a narrow passage for escape. As he tried to gallop through it, a man who had been shot but regained his strength blocked his path, weapon in hand. Just then, a Griqua soldier fired a shot that narrowly missed Moffat, but hit the enemy, clearing his way to safety. This battle not only saved the mission, but also prevented the Mantatees from facing complete destruction. If they had continued their advance, they likely would have reached the borders of the colony, where they would have been driven back and perished from starvation, or at the hands of tribes they had previously defeated. After the battle, Mr. Melville and Robert Moffat gathered many of the Mantatee women and children and brought them to the missionary station. For several days, There was fear that the Mantatees might attack after the Griquas left. The situation became so concerning that the missionaries, along with their families, buried their belongings and temporarily fled to Griqua town for safety. However, when it became clear that the Mantatees had left the area, they returned to the station. The Bechuanas deeply appreciated the missionaries' efforts to protect them during this dangerous time, especially since the missionaries could have easily retreated to the colony with minimal loss. Leaving the Bechuanas to face the invaders alone, for a long time Moffat had realized that the location of their station at Lattakoo was not suitable for missionary work. The severe lack of water, especially during dry seasons, made it difficult to grow crops, and even drinking water was scarce. Taking advantage of the favorable impression Motheby and his people now had of the missionaries, Moffat sought a new location for the station. He found a site 8 miles away, about 3 miles below the Kuruman fountain, where the Kuruman River begins. This spot offered much better conditions for a missionary station than anywhere else within hundreds of miles. Arrangements were made with the Bechuana chiefs to grant about 2 miles of the Kuruman Valley to the London Missionary Society, with proper payment to be made when Moffat returned from Cape Town, where he planned to visit soon. This new station would later be known as Kuruman. The beginning of 1824, the Moffats were in Cape Town. They had gone there to get supplies, seek medical treatment for Mrs. Moffat, whose health had declined, and to discuss the relocation of the station with Dr. Philip. Motheby, eager for his son Peklu to see the land of the white people, sent him and Taisho, one of the main chiefs, to Cape Town with the missionaries. The young prince and Taisho were amazed by what they saw. They were reluctant but eventually agreed to go with Robert Moffat on board one of the ships in the bay. The large hull, tall masts, luxurious cabin and deep hold were all sources of wonder. When they saw a boy climb the rigging to the masthead, their astonishment was complete. Taisho whispered to the young prince,
"Is it not an ape?"
They asked if the waterhouses, ships, unyoked like oxen every night, and if they grazed in the sea to stay alive. When asked what they thought of a ship in full sail entering the harbour, they replied,
"We have no thoughts here. We hope to think again when we get on shore."
On the same day the Moffats arrived in Cape Town, a ship from England brought 3 new missionaries for the Bechuana station. However, only one of them, Mr. Hughes and his wife, were able to accompany the Moffats on their return journey. With Mrs. Moffat's health somewhat improved, the group left Cape Town. After a long and monotonous 2-month journey, Robert and Mary Moffat safely returned to Lattakoo. They had left Mr. and Mrs. Hughes in Griqua Town, where they would stay for a while. Chapter 6. Visit to Makaba. Shortly after his return, while finalizing the arrangements for relocating the missionary station, it was decided that Robert Moffat should make his long-promised visit to Makaba, the chief of the Bangwaketsi. He set out on July 1st, 1824, accompanied by a large group of Griquas who were heading to the region to hunt elephants. They travelled along the edge of the Kalahari Desert for a while, but eventually changed their route due to a lack of water. They visited Pitsana, where a large gathering of natives had assembled, including different sections of the Baralong tribe, who had been driven from their land the previous year during the Mantatee Invasion. From there, they continued their journey until they reached Kwakwa, the home of Makaba and his people, the capital of the Bangwaketsi. The missionary was warmly welcomed by the king, who jokingly remarked,
"I'm surprised you trusted yourselves, unarmed in the town of someone as notorious as I'm said to be."
Makaba treated Moffat and his party generously, declaring,
"My friends, I am perfectly happy. My heart is whiter than milk because you have visited me. Today, I feel like a great man. You are wise and brave to come and see for yourselves and laugh at the lies my enemies spread."
Moffat made several attempts to speak with the chief and his people about spiritual matters, but seemed to have little success. Finally, on the Sabbath, he decided to pay Makaba a formal visit to discuss these topics more seriously. He found the king seated among many of his top men, all busy preparing skins, cutting them, sewing mantles, or sharing news. Sitting down beside Makaba, surrounded by his nobles and councillors, Moffat explained that he had come to share some important news. He spoke about God and the Saviour, but his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. However, one man nearby was intrigued by the miracles of the Redeemer. When he heard that Jesus had raised the dead, he remarked,
"What an excellent doctor he must have been to raise the dead."
This led Moffat to describe Jesus' power and how it would be revealed on the last day during the resurrection. The king, catching the mention of a resurrection, exclaimed in surprise,
"What are these words about? The dead arise."
Yes, all the dead shall arise.
Will my father arise him?
Yes, your father will arise.
Will all the slain in battle arise?
Yes.
And will those who have been killed and devoured by lions, tigers, hyenas, and crocodiles rise again?
Yes, and they will come to judgment.
The king, now with a tone of triumph, as if he had found a flaw in Moffat's words, asked,
"And will those whose bodies have been left to decay on the desert plains and scattered to the winds rise again?"
Yes,
Moffat answered firmly.
Not one will be left behind.
Makaba stared at Moffat for a moment before turning to his people and proclaiming loudly,
"Listen, wise men, whoever is among you, the wisest of past generations, have you ever heard such strange and unheard of news?"
When they responded negatively, he placed his hand on Moffat's chest and said,
"Father, I love you very much. Your visit and presence have made my heart as white as milk. The words from your mouth are sweet as honey, but the words of a resurrection are too great to be heard. I do not want to hear again about the dead rising. The dead cannot arise. The dead must not arise."
Moffat asked,
Why can such a great man refuse knowledge and turn away from wisdom? Tell me, my friend, why must I not speak of a resurrection?
Makaba then raised his arm, strong from battle, and shook his hand as if holding a spear. He replied,
"I have slain my thousands, and shall they arise?"
as Moffat later wrote in his missionary labours.
This was the first time the light of divine revelation had touched the king's mind. His conscience had never before accused him for the countless acts of violence and murder he had committed throughout his life.
As Moffat and his party prepared to return home, the Griqua hunting group, for reasons unknown, decided to return with the missionary instead of staying behind to hunt. This unexpected decision likely saved the lives of Moffat, his companions, and many others. Few hours after leaving Makaba, messengers met the group with a plea from Tawan, the chief of the Barolongs, who was about to be attacked by the Mantatees. When they reached Pitsana, they found that the attack was indeed imminent. The Griquas, about 20 in number, mounted and armed with guns, repelled the Mantatees, saving the town and preventing its inhabitants from fleeing into the Kalahari Desert, where they would have likely perished from hunger and thirst. This also ensured the safety of Moffat and his companions. While Moffat was away from Lattakoo, his wife and those remaining at the station faced great anxiety. A band of raiders had gathered in the Long Mountains, about 40 miles to the west, and after attacking some villages on the Kuruman, they threatened to attack the Batlaping and the mission premises. The Mantatees were also rumoured to be nearby. One night, while Mary Moffat was alone with her children and 2 Bushman children, a loud knock came at the door. When she asked who was there, Motherby himself replied, bringing word that the Mantatees were approaching. Quick message was sent to Mr. Hamilton, who arrived around 8 in the morning. Preparations for flight were made as messengers continued to arrive with alarming news until about noon, when it was confirmed that the Mantatees had changed direction toward the Barolongs. The station was safe, but Mary Moffat was deeply troubled, knowing that the dreaded Mantatees might cross her husband's path as he returned home. Prayer was her source of strength during this ordeal, and her prayers were answered in the mysterious way that Berend and his Griqua party decided to return with Robert Moffat instead of staying to hunt elephants in Bangwaketsi territory. the remainder of 1824 was marked by widespread bloodshed and conflict. War broke out among the Sechwanas, raids were carried out by marauders from the Long Mountains, and unrest spread among the interior tribes. The land was soaked in blood, even the powerful Bangwaketsi were scattered, and their chief, Makaba, was killed. Once again, the missionaries had to flee with their families to Griqua town, leaving Mr. Hamilton, who had no family, in charge of the new station. He kept 2 horses ready for a quick escape in case of danger. At the end of the year, the Kuruman missionaries, Robert and Mary Moffat, Mr. and Mrs. Hughes and Mr. Hamilton, were all at Griqua town, except for Mr. Hamilton, who remained at the station. The new station at Kuruman had been occupied shortly before the missionaries fled. Early in 1825, when the immediate danger had passed, the Moffats, along with Mr. and Mrs. Hughes, rejoined Mr. Hamilton. Around this time, 2 distressing events occurred that greatly affected the Batlaping and their missionaries. First, 2 severe hailstorms swept through part of the region, destroying crops, killing lambs, and stripping the bark from trees. Second, the young Prince Peklu, who had a good nature and was relatively enlightened, died. The missionaries had hoped his influence would have a positive impact on his people. Peklu's death, coupled with another attack on the Batlaping by marauders, led Mothibi and his people to decide to move eastward. However, they remained unsettled for a long time, suffering from attacks and leading a nomadic life. Despite these challenges, work on the new station continued. 3 temporary dwellings had been built, made from a wooden framework filled with reeds and plastered inside and out. The foundations for more permanent structures were also laid. Mr. Hughes returned from Cape Town with supplies, a mason named Millen, and a few Hottentot assistants from Bethelsdorp. The station had a large group of people, and providing food for everyone was difficult. The Kuruman fountain, which is the source of the Kuruman River, emerges from caverns in a small hill. The missionaries planned to use water from the river to irrigate their gardens, so they dug a trench 2 miles long. This was a laborious task, made more difficult and dangerous by the constant threat of robber attacks. The men had to work with their guns nearby in case of an ambush. Moffat described it as dug in troubled times. Sickness and death also affected the missionary households. The Moffats had an infant son who died just 5 days after birth. Mr. Hughes fell seriously ill with a severe cold and nearly died. Although he eventually recovered, his health was not fully restored until he and Mrs. Hughes made a journey to the Cape. In 1827, he left Kuruman and moved to the Griqua mission. Mary Moffat's mother died in October 1825, but the news did not reach her in Africa until April 1826. Reflecting on this period, Robert Moffat wrote,
I shall not attempt to describe our situation during the early days of the new station. Some of our newly arrived assistants, finding themselves in a land without laws and not guided by religion, refused to endure the hardships we patiently accepted and complained bitterly. Armed robbers were constantly raiding, threatening death and destruction. We had to work daily, performing all kinds of heavy labour under a scorching sun in a dry climate where only 1 shower had fallen in the past year. These are just a few examples of the challenges we faced for several years at the new station, all while trying to learn a language that was entirely oral.
Despite these difficulties, Robert Moffat made progress in creating a written language for the native Sechwana tongue. He prepared a spelling book, a catechism, and some small portions of scripture, which were sent to Cape Town to be printed in 1825. However, due to a mistake, these were sent on to England instead, causing significant disappointment and delay. Things began to calm down somewhat in 1826. The discontented Hottentots returned to the colony, leaving the missionaries and Mr. Millen to continue the work of establishing the station, constructing the buildings, and performing other manual labour, with only limited assistance from the Sechwanas. The native population at the station had significantly decreased. Those Batlaping who hadn't moved away had settled around the Kuruman Valley. While they did not oppose the gospel, they seemed largely indifferent to it. The region had suffered from drought for several years, but early in 1826, abundant rain finally fell. The earth quickly became green with new growth, but this hopeful prospect was short-lived. Swarms of locusts descended on the land, completely destroying the vegetation. This led to widespread scarcity, and although the natives caught and ate the locusts, hunger and suffering were still widespread. The missionaries' cattle had to be closely guarded, as they would be stolen the moment they were out of sight. One day, 2 notorious men from the mountains attacked a man who was tending some oxen, killed him, and stole one of the oxen. Robert Moffat was deeply committed to mastering the Sechwana language. By the end of 1826, after moving into his new stone house and with the country somewhat more stable, he decided to leave his home and family temporarily to live among the Barolongs. His goal was to immerse himself in their community and focus entirely on learning their language. He made the journey by ox wagon, accompanied by a wagon driver, a boy, and 2 Barolongs who were traveling to the same destination. The dangers of traveling from tribe to tribe were very real, as illustrated by the following account from Moffat himself.
The 2 Barolongs had brought a young cow with them. Although I advised them to secure her along with the oxen, they jokingly replied that she was too smart to stray from the wagon, even if a lion were nearby. After a small supper, we sang our evening hymn and prayed. I had only just settled into my wagon for the night, when all the oxen suddenly jumped to their feet. A lion had seized the cow just a few steps from where the oxen were tied and dragged it about 30 or 40 yards away. We could clearly hear the lion tearing the animal apart and breaking its bones, while the cow's cries were heart-wrenching. When the noise stopped, I grabbed my gun, but it was too dark to see much, so I aimed where I could hear the lion's jaws at work. I fired repeatedly, and the lion responded with loud roars, even charging toward the wagon, terrifying the oxen. The 2 Barolongs agreed to throw firebrands at the lion to provide some light so I could aim better. But just as they threw them, the flames went out, and the furious animal rushed toward them so quickly that I barely had time to turn and fire between the men and the lion. The men dashed through some thorn bushes, their faces showing sheer terror. We all agreed it would be best to leave the lion alone unless it attacked us. With only a small supply of wood to keep the fire going, one man crept through the bushes on one side of the pool, while I did the same on the other side. As I moved, I glanced up and saw 4 figures between me and the sky. Lions, their attention drawn to the noise I made breaking a dry stick. I quickly retreated on my hands and knees toward the other side of the pool. When I reached the wagon driver, I found him staring nervously in the opposite direction, with good reason. 2 more lions and a cub were watching us, as unsure of us as we were of them. We quickly returned to the wagon and sat by our small fire, listening to the lion devour its prey. Whenever other hungry lions dared to approach, the first lion would chase them off with a terrifying roar, making our poor oxen tremble and filling us with fear. We were deeply concerned that any of the 6 lions we had seen, unafraid of our small fire, might suddenly charge at us.
From these dangers, Moffat was mercifully preserved, and after 6 days of travelling, he reached the village of a young chief named Bogachu. He spent 10 weeks living a semi-savage life in this village, and another one about 20 miles away. Moffat made himself at home among the people, who were kind and enjoyed his company, especially because, when food was scarce, he could use his gun to hunt a rhinoceros or other animals. These hunts were followed by nights of feasting and conversation. Moffat took every opportunity to teach these people about Christianity, but their highest idea of happiness seemed to be having plenty of meat. When Moffat asked one man, who seemed more thoughtful than the others, what the finest sight he could imagine was, the man replied,
"A great fire covered with pots full of meat,"
and added,
"How ugly the fire looks without a pot!"
The journey was a success. Moffat no longer needed an interpreter and could now speak and preach in the native language. When he returned home, he found everything well and felt ready to focus on the work of translation. The mission's prospects began to improve at this time. Several thousand natives had gathered on the opposite side of the valley, near the mission station. They were becoming more settled. And when the missionaries visited them, they would gather in different parts of the town. Attendance at religious services was increasing, and the school was better attended. While no visible signs of spiritual change were yet evident, Moffat and his fellow workers were confident that such change was near. Unfortunately, war broke out again, darkening the mission's brightening prospects. After much prayerful consideration, the missionaries decided to flee once more to Griqua town, losing time and property in the process. Thankfully, when they returned to Kuruman, they found their houses and the remaining property in good condition, a sign that they were gaining influence over the once thieving Bechuanas. However, half the oxen and nearly all the cows had died, leaving them without milk, and the people had fled, leaving behind only the ashes of their homes. Despite their sorrow, the missionaries resolved to resume their work. A few poor natives had stayed at the station, and more were arriving each day. During this difficult time, the arrival of the Reverend Robert Miles, the society's superintendent, brought encouragement. After familiarizing himself with the station's affairs, he suggested the importance of creating hymns in the native language. By regularly singing these hymns, he believed that the great truths of salvation would gradually take root in the people's minds. Moffat took this suggestion to heart and prepared the first hymn in the Sechwana language. The spelling books also arrived, allowing the missionaries to open a school in Sechwana. Mr. Miles returned, and the regular mission work continued. Although they had laboured for 10 years without visible results, it now seemed that the dawn of a new era was about to rise. Yet again, their faith was sorely tested by the threat of war. This time, the danger came from a group of desperadoes advancing from the Orange River, which included some Griquas. The suspense and anxiety were intense, but the missionaries turned to prayer. They decided to stay at their post. The first attack was repelled, thanks to the bravery of an escaped slave named Aaron Josephs, and there was a brief period of peace for about 2 months. However, a second attack on the mission station was soon threatened. Following Moffat's instructions, the heights behind the station were filled with men to create the impression of a large defensive force, though in reality they had fewer than a dozen guns. Seeing these preparations, the attackers paused and, after a short time, sent 2 messengers forward under a flag of truce. Moffat went out to meet them and learned that a renegade Christian Griqua named Janti Guman wanted to speak with him at their camp. A meeting was arranged halfway between the station and the camp. Janti, ashamed to show his face to the missionary, whom he had known at Griqua town, tried to place the blame on another renegade, a Korana chief named Paul, who had once hosted Robert Moffat and visited his home. At that moment, a wagon was seen approaching. Fearing it might contain someone from Griqua town and noticing a hostile movement toward it, Moffat turned to Janti and said,
"I will not meet with you until the wagon and its owners are safely at the station."
He quickly brought the wagon through, which turned out to carry the Wesleyan missionaries, Mr. and Mrs. Archbell from Plattsburgh. Finally, after much hesitation, Paul himself approached. He could not look Moffat in the eye and kept his hat pulled low over his face. He assured Moffat that he personally was in no danger, but threatened to exact revenge on the Batlaping at Kuruman.
"I shall have their blood and their cattle too,"
Paul said, his eyes filled with rage. Moffat spoke with him calmly and patiently, pointing out the enormity of his crimes. Eventually, Moffat's words won Paul over. No shot was fired, and both the station and the Batlaping were spared. Paul then ordered his men to return the cattle and sheep they had stolen that morning, saying,
"Bring back those cows and sheep we took this morning."
It was done. As he prepared to leave, Paul asked,
"Will Minhir not shake hands with me for once?"
Of course I will, but let me see your face.
"That I will not. I do not want to die yet. I can see your face through my hat."
The threat of war was finally averted, and the land experienced peace for the next 50 years. During this time, significant and positive changes occurred at the Kuruman station. Chapter 7. The Awakening. The long-awaited and fervently prayed-for moment had finally arrived. For 10 long years, the devoted missionaries had laboured without seeing any results. Now their hearts were filled with joy as they witnessed the work of the Holy Spirit and saw those who had been lost in heathen darkness come into the light of the gospel. As the Bible says, "The wind blows where it wishes, and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes." So it was with the awakening among the Sechwanas at Kuruman. There was no clear reason for the sudden and intense spiritual awakening among these people. Men who had once scorned the idea of showing emotion now wept as their hearts were softened. The chapel became a place of tears, and some, after listening intently to the preacher, collapsed in hysterics. The small chapel could no longer accommodate the growing numbers who flocked to it. With the voluntary help of Aaron Josephs, a new building was constructed, 51 feet long and 16 feet wide, with clay walls and a thatched roof. This building served as a schoolhouse and place of worship until the larger stone church, which was to be the central feature of the station, could be completed. This temporary church was opened in May 1829, and in the following month, after careful examination, 6 candidates for baptism were chosen from among the inquirers. Speaking of these converts, Robert Moffat said,
"It was truly gratifying to observe the simplicity of their faith, implicitly relying on the atonement of Christ, of which they appeared to have a very clear understanding, considering the previous darkness of their minds on such subjects."
They were baptized on the first Sabbath in July, with a large crowd of spectators from the neighbouring towns and a group of Griquas in attendance. In the evening, the missionaries, the new disciples, and a Griqua, 12 in all, sat down at the Lord's table. An interesting story is connected with this event, highlighting the strong faith of Mary Moffat, sometime before this awakening when the situation seemed bleak. Mary Moffat's friend, Mrs. Greaves of Sheffield, wrote to her, kindly asking if there was anything useful she could send. Mary Moffat replied,
"Send us a communion service. We shall need it someday."
Communication between Kuruman and England was slow, and before a response to her letter arrived, the darkness deepened and the Sechwanas seemed as far from salvation as ever. But on the day before the first converts were received into the Kuruman church, a box arrived from England. It had been on the road for 12 months, and inside were the communion vessels that Mary Moffat had requested more than 2 years earlier. As great as the change was, the missionaries rejoiced with caution. They knew that significant prejudices still needed to be overcome, and that the new Christians would face challenges in their relationships with their non-Christian neighbours. But they prayed and believed that He who had begun the good work would continue to carry it forward. The change in heart quickly led to a change in dress and habits. Those who had been baptized had obtained decent clothing beforehand, preparing it for the occasion with Mrs. Moffat's help. Previously, there had been no need for a sewing school, as the women's work consisted of building houses, raising fences, and tilling the ground. Now, however, Mrs. Moffat began meeting with those who wanted to learn to sew, as often as her health allowed. Soon, she had a diverse group of students, though very few owned a frock or gown. The scarcity of materials was a significant obstacle, but ornaments, which the natives had once highly valued, were now traded for animal skins. These skins were prepared to be almost as soft as cloth and were made into jackets, trousers, and gowns, when a trader visited, British goods were eagerly purchased. As the people progressed in their new habits, some amusing incidents occurred. A man might be seen wearing a jacket with only one sleeve because the other wasn't finished yet, while others walked around in jackets made of duffel with sleeves of various coloured cotton. Gowns resembling Joseph's coat were worn, and dresses were made in such fantastic shapes that it would have been difficult to identify a consistent fashion. Mrs. Moffat became the go-to person for both men and women. One would bring skins to be cut into dresses, another wanted a jacket, a third sought a pattern, and a fourth brought a jacket that had been sewn upside down and asked why it didn't fit. Fat, which they had previously used only for rubbing on their bodies or consuming, was now being used to make candles to provide light in their homes. The prospects for the missionaries continued to brighten, with increasing interest in instruction and a growing desire for knowledge among the new converts. Statements like, "I seek Jesus," and
I am feeling after God. I have been wandering, unaware of my danger, among beasts of prey. Now the day has dawned, and I see my danger.
These statements became common. The missionaries, being cautious and careful, were slow to admit members into their small church, but it became clear that many had truly been saved. Round this time, the peaceful death of a native woman provided significant encouragement. As she sensed her end approaching, she told those around her,
I am going to die. Do not weep because I am leaving you, but weep for your sins and your souls. With me all is well. Do not think that I die like an animal, or that I will sleep forever in the grave. No, Jesus has died for my sins. He has promised to save me, and I am going to be with him.
Just a few months earlier, this woman had been as ignorant as the cattle. Yet she departed with the full assurance of eternal life beyond the grave. For some time, rumours had reached the Kuruman station about a powerful and warlike people who lived to the east, spoke a different language, and were strangers to the Sechwanas. In the latter part of 1829, Moselekatse, the king of the Matabele people, sent 2 envoys to the Kuruman mission station to learn about the customs and teachings of the white men there. These envoys, 2 of the king's headmen, were welcomed and shown the various aspects of life at the station. However, what amazed them most was the public worship in the mission chapel. They listened to the hymns and the address, understanding only part of it, and were astonished to learn that the hymns were not war songs. When it was time for the envoys to depart, they asked Robert Moffat to accompany them, fearing the Sechwana tribes they would have to pass through on their return journey. This led to Moffat's visit to the warlike Moselekatse, over whom he would eventually gain remarkable influence. The details of the journey are too extensive to recount here, but as they travelled, they encountered numerous signs of the devastation caused by the Mantatees and the even more feared Matabele. In places where once there had been thriving towns and villages, only crumbling walls, piles of stones and scattered human skulls remained. The land had become the domain of reptiles and wild beasts, as the original inhabitants had been slaughtered by their savage enemies. The reception Robert Moffat received from Moselekatse is best described in the missionary's own words.
We proceeded directly to the town, and upon riding into the centre of the large fold, we were rather taken by surprise to find it lined by 800 warriors, with an additional 200 concealed on each side of the entrance, as if lying in ambush. We were signalled to dismount, which we did, holding our horses' bridles in our hands. Instantly, the warriors at the gate rushed in with terrifying yells, leaping from the ground with kilts around their waist that hung like loose tails, and holding large shields that startled our horses. They then joined the circle, falling into rank with as much precision as if they had been trained in European military tactics. Here we stood, surrounded by warriors, their kilts made of ape skins, their legs and arms adorned with the hair and tails of oxen, their shields reaching up to their chins, and their heads crowned with feathers. A profound silence followed for about 10 minutes, and then all at once began a war song, their feet stamping in perfect rhythm with the music. No one approached us, though every eye was fixed on us. After the song, there was silence again, and Moselekatse emerged from behind the lines, accompanied by an interpreter and attendants carrying meat, beer, and other food. He greeted us warmly and seemed overjoyed.
The wagons were objects of awe for the dark-skinned monarch. He examined them carefully, particularly the wheels, and one detail remained a mystery to him, how the iron tire around the wheel could be in one continuous piece without any visible end or joint. Umbeit, the headman who had visited the mission station before, explained what he had seen in the blacksmith's shop.
"My eyes,"
he said, pointing to Moffat's hand,
"saw that very hand cut these bars of iron, remove a piece from one end and then join them as you see now."
Moselekatse, still puzzled, asked,
"Does he give medicine to the iron?"
Umbat replied,
"No, nothing is used but fire, a hammer, and a chisel."
Moselekatse was a powerful chieftain, an absolute despot who ruled over a tribe of fierce warriors who knew no will but his. He was the terror of the surrounding regions. His smile meant life, while his frown brought horror and death. Yet even in his savage heart, there were chords that could be touched by kindness. During the 8 days Moffat spent in his town, he received many signs of Moselekatse's friendship. During one of their first meetings, the monarch, placing his hand on Moffat's shoulder, said,
"My heart is all white as milk. I am still amazed by the love of a stranger who has never seen me. You have fed me, protected me, and carried me in your arms. I live today because of you, a stranger."
When Moffat replied that he was unaware of having done him any such service, Moselekatse pointed to his 2 ambassadors and said,
"These are great men. Umbate is my right hand. When I sent them to see the land of the white men, I sent my ears, my eyes, my mouth. What they heard, I heard. What they saw, I saw. And what they said, it was Moselekatse who said it. You fed them and clothed them, and when they were to be killed, you were their shield. You did it unto me. You did it unto Moselekatse, the son of Machobani."
Moffat then explained the purpose of the missionary's work and shared the truths of the gospel with the African king. On one occasion, the king arrived with a group of his warriors who stayed a short distance away, dancing and singing.
Their yells and shouts,
Moffat later recounted,
their wild leaps and contorted gestures would have made a stranger think they were more like a company of fiends than men.
As Moffat watched, he reflected on the miseries of the savage life and spoke to the king about man's fall and redemption. The king asked,
"Why are you so eager for me to abandon war and stop killing men?"
Moffat pointed to the human bones scattered across the land and replied,
"They speak in a dreadful language, and to me they say, 'Whoever sheds man's blood, by man, his blood will also be shed.'"
Moffat also spoke of the resurrection, a shocking concept for a warrior and murderer like Moselekatse. The king's kindness extended to Moffat's journey home. He provided an abundance of food and assigned several warriors to escort Moffat's wagon and protect him from lions along the way. After a 2-month absence, Moffat safely returned home, where he found that all was well and that the divine blessing continued to rest upon the mission. Copious rain had fallen, and the fields and gardens were flourishing. The converts and many others, leaving behind their old farming traditions, followed the missionaries' example by leading water to their gardens. They grew not only native crops like grain, pumpkins, kidney beans, and watermelons, but also vegetables introduced by the missionaries, such as maize, wheat, barley, peas, potatoes, carrots, onions, and tobacco. This latter crop, which they had previously purchased from the Bahurutsi, now became a profitable item of trade. They also began planting fruit trees, an example of the natives' enthusiasm which was sometimes misguided, can be seen in the following incident. The path of the missionary's water trench appeared to ascend slightly as it ran along the side of a hill. Believing this would prevent the water from flowing, several of the natives eagerly set to work, cutting new channels that led directly uphill, hoping that the water would eventually follow their efforts. Meanwhile, the spiritual life at the station continued to develop alongside these physical improvements. The temporary chapel remained well attended, and there was a noticeable increase in the people's seriousness about their faith. Progress was made in reading, and there was every reason to be encouraged. Early in 1830, after the second mission house had been completed and occupied by Mr. Hamilton, the foundation was laid for a new substantial stone church. However, circumstances, particularly the difficulty in obtaining suitable timber for the roof, delayed its completion for several years. The task of translation was steadily pursued. By June 1830, Robert Moffat had completed the translation of the Gospel of Luke into Sechwana. He and his wife then embarked on a long-planned journey to the coast. The purposes of the journey were to enroll their 2 older children in school, get the translation of Luke printed, and raise funds among friends in the colony for the construction of the new place of worship. During their journey, they stopped at Philippolis, where they met French missionaries Roland and Lemieux of the Paris Protestant Missionary Society, as well as Mr. and Mrs. Bailey, who had been appointed by the London Missionary Society to the Kuruman mission. In Grahamstown, Mary Moffat stayed behind to place their children in a Wesleyan school nearby, while Robert visited several mission stations in Kaffirland and later some within the colony. He finally reached Cape Town in October 1830. In those early days, printing in Cape Town was still in its infancy. When Robert Moffat sought to have the Gospel of Luke in Sechwana printed, it became necessary to request permission from the governor to use the government printing office. The request was gladly granted, but there were no compositors available to undertake the work. This challenge, coupled with the promise of an excellent printing press that Dr. Philip had secured for the Kuruman mission, prompted Moffat to learn the art of printing himself. He was joined by Mr. Edwards, who had been newly appointed to the Kuruman station. Under the guidance of the office's assistant, they not only completed the task but also gained a solid understanding of printing. In addition to the Gospel of Luke, they printed a small hymn book in the Sechwana language. However, these efforts, carried out during the hottest season of the year, took a toll on Moffat's health, and he suffered a severe attack of bilious fever. By the time he was ready to leave Cape Town, he was so weakened that he had to be carried on board the ship on a mattress. Despite the rough sea passage to Algoa Bay, the journey greatly aided his recovery. On their return journey, the Moffats were delayed at Bethelsdorp due to sickness among their oxen and the birth of a daughter, whom they named Elizabeth. After some time, they resumed their journey, accompanied by Mr. and Mrs. Edwards, and arrived at Kuruman in June 1831. They brought with them the edition of the Gospel of Luke, the hymn book in Sechwana, a printing press, type, paper, and ink, along with generous contributions from friends in the colony for the construction of the mission church. The arrival of the printing press caused great amazement among the natives. Lessons, spelling books, and catechisms were soon being produced for the schools. The process of printing, where a blank sheet of paper would momentarily disappear and then re-emerge covered in letters, was beyond their comprehension. One man, after obtaining a freshly printed sheet, ran excitedly through the village, showing it to everyone and exclaiming that it had been made instantly with a round black hammer, referring to the printer's ball, and a shake of the arm. Among the supplies they brought back from Cape Town was a large box of clothing materials sent by a friend from Manchester, Miss Lees. With these resources, and with the help of Mrs. Edwards and Mrs. Bailey, a larger sewing school was established, greatly benefiting the natives by improving their comfort and appearance. The congregation at Kuruman continued to grow, and new members were added to the church. However, this period of joy was also tempered by sorrow. A smallpox outbreak spread through the country, claiming many lives, including one of Robert and Mary Moffat's daughters. Towards the end of 1832, the missionaries at Kuruman were encouraged by a visit from Dr. Philip, who arranged for the two French missionaries, Roland and Lemieux, to start a new mission station at Motito, located nearly 40 miles away to the northeast. In January 1835, a scientific expedition led by Dr. Andrew Smith arrived at Moffat's station. This visit seemed divinely timed, providing much-needed support to Robert Moffat and his devoted wife, Mary, who were in great distress. At the time, Mr. Edwards was away, and Robert had been overworked, leading to an attack of intermittent fever. When Dr. Smith arrived, he quickly administered medical aid, and under his skilled care, Robert soon recovered. On March 10th, another son was born to the Moffat family. However, shortly afterward, Mary Moffat suddenly fell seriously ill and became so weak that her recovery seemed hopeless. Dr. Smith was away on a surveying mission at the time, but upon hearing of the dire situation at Kuruman, he rushed back to offer his help. Reflecting on this unexpected support, Robert Moffat wrote in his book,
"His tender sympathy and unremitting attention in that trying season, during which all hope of her recovery had fled, can never be erased from our grateful recollection, for in the midst of his active and laborious engagements at the head of the expedition, he watched for several successive nights, with fraternal sympathy, what appeared to be the dying pillow of my beloved partner, nor did he leave before she was out of danger."
This experience forged a lifelong friendship between the Moffats and Dr. Smith, who was always fondly remembered for his timely assistance during their hour of need. Not long after these events, Dr. Smith invited Robert Moffat to accompany the expedition on a visit to Moselekatse and the Matabele country. Moselekatse was thrilled to see his missionary friend again. While the scientific expedition was granted permission to travel through any part of the king's territories, Moffat was kept as Moselekatse's guest. They travelled together in Moffat's wagon to visit several Matabele towns, engaging in many conversations during which Moffat faithfully discussed the importance of religion and the harmful consequences of the king's policies. During this 3-month journey, several important outcomes were achieved. One was the paving of the way for American missionaries to eventually reside with Moselekatse. Another was the survey of the region to locate suitable timber for the roof of the new Kuruman church. This timber, later collected by Messrs. Hamilton and Edwards, required the woodcutters to travel 250 miles to obtain it. The wood was then fashioned into the church's roof, which still stands today as a monument to the combined efforts of Hamilton, Moffat, and Edwards. Onlookers marvel at how such a feat was accomplished with the limited resources available at the time. Upon Moffat's return home, his wife, following Dr. Smith's advice, left for the Cape to regain her strength. Meanwhile, Robert Moffat embarked on itinerant preaching among the scattered Bechuanas. One particularly memorable visit was to a village 150 miles from Kuruman, where Chief Moshu and his people resided. On the first day, Moffat preached 3 times and answered questions from the curious villagers. Many expressed a strong desire to learn to read, and Moffat distributed the spelling books he had with him. Even some of the village's headmen were eager to try reading and asked Moffat to teach them. He found a large, torn sheet with the alphabet printed on it and laid it on the ground. The men knelt around it, some viewing the letters upside down.
"I commenced pointing with a stick,"
Moffat later recounted,
"and when I pronounced one letter, all hallooed with enthusiasm. When I suggested we might manage with a bit less noise, one man replied that he was sure the louder he shouted, the quicker his tongue would get used to the seeds, as he called the letters."
Later, a group of young people enthusiastically grabbed the missionary, urging,
"Oh, teach us the ABC with music."
They led him into one of the largest native houses, which quickly filled with people. Moffat pitched the tune of Old Lang Syne to the alphabet, and soon the melody echoed throughout the village. Despite getting permission to retire for the night, around 2 or 3 in the morning, Moffat's rest was interrupted by the persistent singing of the eager learners. When he awoke after a brief sleep, he was greeted by the familiar strains of the Scottish tune coming from all directions. Significant progress was made by the people in their Christian knowledge. Chief Moshu brought his daughter to Mrs. Moffat for instruction, and his brother sent his son to Mr. Lemieux at Motito for the same purpose. The mission at Kuruman continued to flourish, both at the main station and at the outposts. Many Sechwanas joined the church, both at Kuruman and in Griqua town. Under Mr. Edwards' leadership, the number of readers grew significantly, and the infant school, started and run by Mrs. Edwards with the help of a native girl, proved to be very successful. Civilization advanced as well, with some natives purchasing wagons and using oxen for labor that had previously been done by women. The demand for clothing increased so much that a merchant named Hume, a trustworthy trader in whom the missionaries had confidence, built a house and settled at the station. After much effort, the new church was finally opened in November 1838. The opening service was attended by between 800 and 900 people, and on the following Sabbath, 150 members participated in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. Persevering Christian love, combined with strong faith, much prayer, and tireless work, had transformed what was once a barren wilderness into a fruitful land. Chapter 8. Visit to England. Robert Moffat had been diligently working on translating the Bible into the Sechwana language, dedicating all available time to this important task. By the end of 1838, he had completed the entire New Testament. To regain their health and to oversee the printing of the Sechwana New Testament, the Moffats journeyed to Cape Town. However, it quickly became clear that Cape Town, like Kuruman, lacked the resources to handle such a large-scale project, making it necessary for the printing to be done in England. It had been 22 years since the young missionary had stood on the deck of the Alacrity and bid farewell to his homeland. Throughout those years, Robert and Mary Moffat had never lost their deep connection to their native country. They eagerly received letters and newspapers, cherishing the memory of friends in the distant British Isles. Now they were about to set foot once again on those well-loved shores, eager to share with the people of England the remarkable story of God's work among the savage tribes of South Africa. In those days, there were no fast castle steamships making the journey in just 20 days. Instead, they secured passage on a small ship returning from China, which had troops on board. The journey was fraught with challenges. Measles were rampant at the Cape, and sickness was present on the ships. Even before the vessel had left Table Bay, another daughter was born to the Moffats, bringing both joy and concern. Just 3 days after her birth, their 6-year-old son Jamie, lying beside his ailing mother, passed away, with the words,
"Oh, that will be joyful when we meet to part no more,"
on his lips as he entered the better land. On June 6, 1839, the ship anchored off Cowes, and a few days later Robert and Mary Moffat arrived in London. The reception for Robert Moffat was overwhelmingly enthusiastic, and he was in such high demand at public meetings that it was difficult for him to find time to visit his own family and friends. In the 20 years since he had left, much had changed in their homes in Dukenfield and Inverkeithing. Mary Moffat's elderly father was still alive, but her mother and a brother had passed away. Another brother was living in America, and a third was a missionary in Madras. Robert's parents were still living, but he had lost a brother and 2 sisters. Many friends who had supported the Moffats during their years of service gathered around them, including Mrs. Greaves of Sheffield, who had donated the communion service, and Miss Lees of Manchester. Though many significant events marked their visit to England, space does not allow for all the details. At the time, a great wave of missionary enthusiasm was sweeping across the country, and Moffat found himself travelling from town to town with little time for rest. In May 1840, he preached the anniversary sermon for the London Missionary Society. The annual meeting at Exeter Hall was so packed that after giving his speech in the large upper hall, he had to repeat it in the smaller hall below. One memorable story Moffat shared during his speech at the Bible Society's May meeting illustrated the value a native woman placed on a single gospel in her own language. He recounted,
"She was a Matabele captive. Once, while visiting the sick, I found her sitting and weeping with a portion of the Word of God in her hand. I asked, 'My child, what is the cause of your sorrow? Is the baby still unwell?'
'No, my baby is well.'
'Is it your mother-in-law?' I inquired.
'No, it is my own dear mother who bore me.'
She wept again, and holding out the Gospel of Luke in her tear-soaked hand, she said,
'My mother will never see this word. She will never hear this good news. Oh, my mother and my friends, they live in heathen darkness, and shall they die without seeing the light that has shone on me, and without tasting that love which I have tasted?'
She raised her eyes to heaven, sighed a prayer, and I heard her whisper again,
'My mother, my mother.'"
Moffat had hoped to quickly print the Sechwana New Testament and return to South Africa before winter, but delays kept him in England until January 1843, when he finally set sail for Africa again. In 1840, two new missionaries, William Ross and David Livingstone, were appointed to the Bechuana mission. With them, Robert Moffat was able to send 500 copies of the Sechwana New Testament. As the sheets of the New Testament were being printed, someone suggested to Robert Moffat that adding the Psalms would greatly enhance the work. With his usual determination, he immediately began the task. A few months after William Ross and David Livingstone had sailed for Africa, Moffat had the joy of sending over 2,000 copies of the New Testament, now bound with the Psalms, to South Africa. By the end of the 1843, a total of 6,000 copies had been sent out. In addition, he undertook and completed a revision of the Book of Scripture Lessons. During this time, there was also a demand for him to write a book, which led to the creation of his well-known work, Missionary Labours and Scenes in South Africa, published in 1842 and met with great success. As the time approached for Robert and Mary Moffat to return to their beloved home at Kuruman, valedictory services of enthusiastic character were held in Scotland, Newcastle, Manchester, and London. In Edinburgh, Robert Moffat was presented with a copy of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, and in Newcastle he received a set of scientific instruments. These and earlier meetings during his stay in England greatly energized missionary work abroad. When the Moffats embarked at Gravesend on January 30th, 1843, accompanied by two new missionaries for the Bechuana field, they left with the esteem of a wide circle of friends and the fervent prayers of many supporters. The Moffats landed in Cape Town on April 10th and 6 weeks later boarded a small coasting vessel for Algoa Bay. At Bethelsdorp, a village just beyond Port Elizabeth, they rejoined Messrs. Ashton and Inglis, who, along with their wives, had travelled ahead by steamer. However, they were detained there for several months, waiting for a ship to arrive from England, carrying a large quantity of baggage for the missionaries and their work. Finally, the journey began. The long line of ox wagons wound their way across the landscape, eventually crossing the Orange River on a pont, or floating bridge. At the Vaal River, about 150 miles from Kuruman, the missionary party was met by David Livingstone, who had ridden out to greet them. From that point onward, friends, both white and black, vied with each other to express their joy at the Moffats' return. As they drew nearer to Kuruman, their progress resembled a royal procession. Finally, Between 2 and 3 o'clock on December 10th, 1843, Robert and Mary Moffat sat down once again in their own home, surrounded by the people they had served so faithfully and loved so deeply. The natives were overjoyed to have their beloved missionary and his wife back among them. In a letter published in the Missionary magazine in October 1844, Moffat described their reception.
Many were the hearty welcomes we received, all appearing eager to show their joy. Old and young, even the little children, would shake hands with us. Some expressed their joy with an air of heathen wildness, while others shed silent tears. There were those whose hearts had grown weary with deferred hope, who would ask again and again, "Do our eyes indeed behold you?" Thus, we found ourselves once more among a people who loved us and had longed for our return.
With the mission significantly reinforced, it was decided that Mr. and Mrs. Ross would go to Tong, about 100 miles east of Kuruman, where a portion of the Sechwana tribe had settled under Mahura, the brother of Mothibi. Meanwhile, Edwards and Livingston were to begin work among the Bakatla, located 200 miles to the northeast. Inglis was assigned to the same area, leaving the regular missionary staff at Kuruman to consist of the Venerable Meister Hamilton, who had been with the Sechwana mission since its inception in 1816, along with Mr. and Mrs. Ashton and the Moffats. The place where Edwards and Livingston had gone was a large native town near lion territory. These lions frequently harassed the cattle and deprived the missionaries of sleep. A hunt was eventually organized, and Livingstone joined the party. During the hunt, he was attacked by a lion and sustained a broken and mangled arm, but was saved by the bravery of his native servant Mabalwe, who also suffered severe bites. While recovering from his injury, Livingstone visited Kuruman, where he won the heart of Robert Moffat's eldest daughter, also named Mary. Shortly after, Mary Moffat became Mary Livingstone, and she accompanied her husband to Chonwane, where he was stationed for a time with Sekula, the chief of the Bakwena. Life at the Kuruman mission was busy and demanding. All the missionaries were fully occupied. Robert Moffat's primary work was Bible translation, and he received much critical assistance from his colleague Ashton, who also took on most of the duties in the printing office, freeing Moffat to focus on his translations. However, other responsibilities also required attention. The natives needed guidance and support. New dwelling houses had to be enlarged, and additional schoolrooms were needed. Since there were no funds available to pay artisans, the missionaries had to do much of the labor themselves. Additionally, because there wasn't enough money to cover the costs of the new schoolrooms, the missionaries' wives opened a small store to sell clothing to the natives, raising funds for the mission's needs. The Reverend J.J. Freeman, who visited Africa in 1849, provides a vivid description of the Kuruman station as he saw it.
It wears a very pleasing appearance. The mission premises, along with the walled gardens opposite, form a wide and long street. The chapel is a substantial and well-looking stone building. Beside it stands Mr. Moffat's house, simple yet commodious. In a nearby cottage, the Venerable Hamilton was spending his declining days, extremely feeble, but comforted by the motherly care of his colleague's wife. The gardens were well stocked with fruit and vegetables, requiring much water, which was easily obtained from the fountain. On Sunday morning, the chapel bell rang for early service. After breakfast at 7, everyone was ready for the schools by 8:30. The infants were taught by Miss Moffat in their schoolhouse, while more advanced classes gathered in the open air or in nearby buildings. By 10, the separate teaching ended, and young and old assembled for public worship. The sanctuary, spacious, lofty, and airy, was comfortably filled with men, women, and children, most of whom were decently dressed.
This description is enriched by a scene often observed at Kuruman, as shared in Robert and Mary Moffat by their son John A. Moffat. He writes,
"The public services were, of course, conducted in the Sechwana language. Once a week, the missionary families gathered for an English devotional meeting. It was also customary for there to be a short truce from work every evening as the sun went down. A particular spot on an eminence at the back of the station became the common meeting place. Here the missionary fathers of the hamlet would sit, each on his accustomed stone. Before them lay the broad valley, once a reedy marsh, now reclaimed and divided into garden lands, its edges lined with long watercourses, shaded by grey willows and dark green syringa trees. On the low ground along the valley stood the church, surrounded by the mission houses and schools. On the heights above were the native villages, mostly composed of round, conical huts that resembled corn stacks from a distance, with a few more ambitious attempts at house building in the form of semi-European cottages. To the east stretched a grassy plain extending to the horizon, while to the west lay a similar plain across which, about 5 miles away, was a range of low hills. Down to the right, in a bushy dell, was the small burying ground marked by a few trees.
These descriptions capture the essence of the Kuruman mission, highlighting the progress made under the Moffat's leadership, the peaceful routines of daily life, and the strong sense of community among both the missionaries and the native people they served. In 1845, Robert Moffat narrowly escaped a serious accident while overseeing the construction of a new corn mill. While ensuring that the mill was properly started, he carelessly stretched his arm over 2 cogwheels. In an instant, his shirt sleeve was caught and pulled into the machinery, along with his arm. Fortunately, the mill was stopped in time, but not before an ugly wound, 6 inches long with torn edges, was inflicted on his arm. This injury forced Moffat to rest for many weeks, but he eventually recovered. For the next 4 or 5 years, life at Kuruman continued steadily. In 1846, Mary Moffat embarked on a journey to visit the Livingstons at Sechwana. She joined a native hunting party for safety and took her 3 younger children with her. The journey was fraught with the usual dangers, as illustrated in a letter she wrote to her husband.
I am very glad of Bowie's company. I should indeed have felt very solitary with my lone wagon and ignorant people, but he is so completely at home in this field that one feels quite at ease. We do not stop at night by the waters, but come to them at midday, and then leave around 3 or 4 o'clock. We constantly have to be on the lookout for lions, as we come across their spoor every day, and the people sometimes hear them roar. Just before stopping today, Bowie, who was on horseback searching for water, encountered a majestic lion. The lion stood still and looked at him. Bowie tried to scare it off, but the lion held its ground. Realizing the danger, Bowie decided to shoot, breaking the lion's leg and disabling it from visiting us.
In early 1847, a general meeting of those involved in the Sechwana mission was held at Lattakoo, near the present-day Diamond Fields. On his way home from this meeting, Moffat visited several bat-lapping villages along the Kolong River. He observed significant progress in recent years, with a fierce struggle taking place between heathenism and Christianity. In each village, a small group of believers had formed, led by native teachers who had received several months of training at Kuruman. In the same year, 1847, Mary Moffat left for the Cape to make arrangements for the education of her younger children. Since Robert could not leave his work, she undertook the journey alone, accompanied only by 4 Sechwana men and a maid. These partings were deeply painful for her as a mother. The time spent on the road, though it extended to 2 months, felt all too short, and she was acutely aware that she might never again have her young children around her. Their son John was placed at a school in Cape Town, while their 2 daughters were sent to England under the care of a trustworthy minister. Reflecting on the heart-wrenching separation from her beloved children, Mary Moffat wrote,
Though my heart was heaving with anguish, I joyfully and thankfully acceded forthwith to the offer of the Reverend J. Crombie Brown to take the children, and set about preparations in good earnest. This was about the end of January. On the 10th of February they embarked, and after spending the night on board, I tore myself from my darlings to return to my desolate lodgings, to contemplate my solitary journey, and to go to my husband and home childless.
Truly, she left all and followed him. By 1848, Robert Moffat had completed the translation of the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes into Sechwana and had begun work on Isaiah. In 1849, Pilgrim's Progress was added to the Sechwana literature, and the work of translation continued steadily. Mr. Ashton also contributed by translating line upon line into the native tongue. While Kuruman remained peaceful and relatively prosperous, storm clouds were gathering to the east that would soon cast a dark shadow over the entire Sechwana mission. The Boers' encroachments on native lands led to widespread bloodshed and the displacement of several native tribes, resulting in the abandonment of mission work among them. One of the early victims was Mose Lekatse, who, after being attacked in 1837, had retreated far to the northeast. For years, little was heard of him, and his very existence became a matter of speculation. David Livingstone had settled with Sechele at Kolobeng, using it primarily as a base for visiting the eastern tribes and conducting missionary work among them. Despite many challenges, significant progress was made, and the Sechwana scriptures were distributed among the people. However, as the Boers advanced, the natives were dispossessed of their lands, and missionaries were expelled from the region. Recognizing that the mission work in this area could no longer continue, Livingstone turned his attention northward and began the series of explorations that would define the rest of his life. Sechele, meanwhile, retreated to a mountain stronghold named Lithubaruba, located to the northwest. As time went on, Robert Moffat increasingly felt the urgency of completing the monumental task he had undertaken, the translation of the entire Bible into Sechwana. He seized every available moment to work on it, often laboring late into the night. However, numerous interruptions made this work exceedingly difficult. He wrote,
Many are the times I have sat down and got my thoughts somewhat in order, with pen in hand to write a verse, the correct rendering of which I just arrived at, after wading through other translations and lexicons, when someone enters my study with some complaint he has to make, or counsel to ask, or medical advice and medicine to boot, a tooth to be extracted, a subscription to the auxiliary to be measured or counted, or one calls to say he is going to the colony and wishes something like a passport. Then strangers from other towns and visitors from the interior arrive, who all seem to claim a right to my attentions.
This relentless work began to take a toll on Moffat's health. His once strong and robust frame, sustained by an iron constitution, began to show signs of strain that could not be ignored. He developed a peculiar condition in his head, characterized by a constant roaring noise, like the sound of a waterfall, and a persistent buzzing, as if water were boiling up inside. This affliction never ceased day or night, leading to significant sleep loss. Ironically, his only relief came during periods of study and preaching, when the symptoms seemed to diminish. But as soon as these activities ended, the condition reasserted itself with full force. In 1851, the rebellion of the Cat River Hottentots erupted, a significant event that cast a shadow over the missionaries of South Africa and the mission work in general. The rebellion brought unwelcome scrutiny and criticism, adding to the already heavy burdens carried by missionaries like Moffat. In 1852, Mr. Hamilton, who had been a faithful colleague of Robert Moffat and a missionary at Kuruman for 34 years, passed away. The following year, Mary Moffat received the sorrowful news that her beloved father had also passed at the venerable age of 90 years. Round this time, Robert Moffat received a letter from the directors of the London Missionary Society urging him to take sick leave, either by visiting the Cape or returning to England. However, Moffat, recognizing the absolute need for rest and change, decided to seek relaxation by visiting his old native friend, Mose Lekatse. He was also concerned about the fate of his son-in-law David Livingstone, who had set out long before to explore the tribes along the Zambezi River. carrying supplies in hopes of aiding Livingstone. Moffat bade his faithful wife farewell in May 1854 and embarked on a journey to a largely unknown region 700 to 800 miles away. He was accompanied by Mr. Edward's son, who had laboured with Moffat at Kuruman, and a young man named James Chapman, who joined the expedition for trade purposes. After several days of travelling through a desert landscape, they reached Seychelles' mountain stronghold. Moffat found Seychelles facing significant difficulties, yet still steadfast in the faith into which Livingstone had baptized him. Continuing their journey, the party travelled another 120 miles through the desert to reach Shoshong, the residence of another chief and his tribe. After wandering for 18 days in a new and unfamiliar region without guides, they finally arrived at a village inhabited by natives under the rule of the Matabele king, Moselekatse. For several days, Moffat and his companions were not allowed to advance further into the territory. The Induna, chief, in charge of the outpost, was cautious and feared making a mistake. Finally, however, they received a message permitting them to proceed, and they drew near to the royal abode of Moselekatse. The chief was overjoyed to reunite with his old friend Moshete, Moffat's name among the Matabele. An account of this emotional reunion is recorded in Moffat's journal, from which the following excerpt is taken.
On turning around, there he sat. How changed! The vigorous, active and nimble chief of the Matabele, now aged, sitting on a skin, lame in his feet, unable to walk or even to stand. I entered, he grasped my hand, gave one earnest look, and drew his mantle over his face. It would have been an awful sight for his people to see the hero of 100 fights wipe from his eyes the falling tears. He spoke not, except to pronounce my name, Machete, again and again. He looked at me again, his hand still holding mine, and he again covered his face. My heart yearned with compassion for his soul. Drawing a little nearer to the outside, so as to be within sight of Mokumbate, his venerable counsellor, he poured out his joy to him.
The old chief was suffering from dropsy, but under Moffat's medical care he recovered and was soon able to walk again. The advice Moffat had given him during their previous interactions had not been entirely forgotten. The officers attending Moselekatse, as well as those of lower ranks, noted that the harshness of his rule had lessened since that time. Moffat stayed with Moselekatse for nearly 3 months. After much persuasion, Moselekatse finally granted Moffat permission to preach the gospel to the Matabele people, a privilege that had always been denied before. On September 24, 1854, the Matabele people received their first instruction on the subjects of creation, providence, death, redemption, and immortality. Moffat intended to journey beyond the Matabele territory to reach the Makololo tribe at their town of Linyanti, where he planned to leave supplies for Livingstone should he return safely from St. Paul de Loanda on the west coast. However, Moselekatse, the Matabele king, was reluctant to let Moffat go alone and eventually decided to accompany him. The Makololo and Matabele, like many other native tribes, were hostile to each other, which complicated the journey. With bags and boxes carried on the heads of some men who were familiar with the terrain, the party set out, but after reaching the farthest outpost of the Matabele, Moselekatse declared that it was impossible for the wagons to proceed any further. At Moffat's earnest request, the king sent a group of his men ahead with the supplies. These supplies eventually reached the Makololo, who stored them on an island and built a roof over them for protection. When Livingstone returned from the west coast some months later, he found the supplies safe and intact. Towards the end of October, Moffat bid farewell to Moselekatse. The king urged him to stay longer, lamenting that he had not yet spent enough time with him or shown him sufficient kindness. Moffat replied,
"You have overwhelmed me with kindness, and I shall now return with a heart overflowing with thanks."
Before leaving, Moffat left the king with a supply of medicines to help maintain his health and advised him to give up beer drinking. He also encouraged Moselekatse to welcome any Christian teacher who might come, just as he had welcomed Moffat. The long return journey was uneventful, and Moffat safely reached his home. The journey significantly improved his health, strengthened his relationships with the people of the interior, and filled him with hopeful anticipation for the advancement of Christianity in those distant regions. Chapter 9. The Sechwana Bible. The great task was finally completed after nearly 30 years of work. The Word of God was now fully translated into the language of the Bechuana people, ready for them to read and understand. For Robert Moffat, the work was incredibly challenging. He spared no effort or hardship in completing it. He even left his home and lived in difficult conditions for nearly 3 months to master the language. Despite having no special training for this task and facing many challenges, he not only learned the language but broke it down into its basic parts and then put it together in a structured and grammatical way. His deep desire was to translate the entire Bible into the native language. As he grew older, the need to finish the work became more urgent. Any time spent on anything other than his mission work or translation duties felt like wasted time. Near the end, he wrote,
"When I pick up a newspaper, I can only glance at it, feeling like I'm doing something wrong. Sometimes I'm drawn in by something interesting, but I read it quickly, my heart racing, because I know I'm taking time away from my main purpose. However, I feel at peace when I'm doing anything directly related to my missionary work."
But now the work was done. The last page was sent to the printer, the last verse of the Old Testament was finished, and the heavy responsibility of translating the Word of God was lifted from his mind. He later spoke about his feelings on this in a speech given at Port Elizabeth during his final departure from South Africa. The Chronicle of the London Missionary Society reported on this in August 1870.
"Finally,"
he said about starting the task,
"I decided that if no one else would do it, I would take it on myself. I fully committed to the work. For many years, I had no free time, spending every spare moment on translation, and I was hardly present even with my own family. Every day required hard work, physically and mentally. This was especially true when Mr. Edwards was with us. Our situation felt almost like slavery. But the work progressed, and eventually, I had the satisfaction of completing the New Testament. The Home Society printed 6,000 copies. When Dr. Livingstone arrived, he urged me to start on the Old Testament immediately. That was an enormous task. Before beginning, I had many sleepless nights. Everyone wanted me to take it on, so I began, working on it whenever I had time, day and night. I kept at it until I finished the Book of Kings, but by then, I was completely exhausted. The directors feared I was working myself to death. They advised me to go home and leave the work, but I chose differently. I decided to visit Moselekatse, and I left with Brother Edward's son. By the time I found Moselekatse, I had recovered. I returned and resumed my work, continuing until it was finished. I can't describe my feelings when I wrote the last verse. I could hardly believe I was still in the world. It was so hard to grasp that my years of work were done. Whether from weakness or mental strain, I don't know, but I felt like I might die, and I was completely at peace with it. To overcome this feeling, I returned to my manuscript, rereading and reviewing it until I regained my sense of reality. This was the most extraordinary time of my life, a period I will never forget. My emotions finally poured out as I fell to my knees, thanking God for His grace and strength to finish my task. My work was done, and now I see the Word of God being read by thousands of Bechuanas in their own language.
In a speech at the Bible Society's annual meeting during his first visit to England in 1839, Robert Moffat shared an incident that highlighted the importance of having the Bible in the native language. While discussing his translation of the Gospel of Luke, he described the stark difference between unconverted heathens and Christian converts. When the heathens saw the converts reading the book that had transformed them, they asked if the converts spoke to it. The converts replied,
"No, it speaks to us, for it is the word of God."
The strangers then asked,
"Does it really speak?"
The Christians responded,
"Yes, it speaks to the heart."
This explanation was true and often demonstrated in reality. Among those who heard the book read by others, it became common to say that the readers were
turning their hearts inside out.
In 1854, Mary Moffat visited the colony again and was away from home when Robert returned from his journey to Moselekatse. Around that time, he received news of his mother's death, the woman who had first inspired his passion for missionary work. She passed away as she had lived, a godly and consistent woman, at the age of 84. In 1856, Dr. Livingstone visited England after his remarkable journey from Loanda on the west coast to Kuruman on the east, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean. His visit and the stories he shared about the land and its people reignited interest in missionary work, especially among the Matabele and Makololo tribes. The London Missionary Society decided to establish missions among them. Since the Makololo lived in a marshy area full of rivers, it was necessary for them to move to the north bank of the Zambezi River, across from where the Matabele lived on the south bank, to begin the mission. However, the two tribes were enemies. To resolve this hostility, the society decided to establish missions among both tribes at the same time. With this goal, the directors wrote to Robert Moffat, asking him to spend a year with the Matabele, bringing 2 younger men with him to start a mission among the tribe. This letter reached him just as he had finished translating and printing the Old Testament. Even though he was 62 years old and had already spent 41 years working hard for the society, he decided to go. He felt it was necessary to start immediately to prepare Moselekatse and his people for the arrival of missionaries. So, once again, Robert Moffat left Kuruman and set out on the long and difficult journey through the African desert to visit his old friend and secure his consent for the missionaries to settle among his people. On his way, he visited Chief Sechela before continuing to Moselekatse's headquarters. The king wasn't very eager to welcome missionaries for himself and his people. He was somewhat suspicious, remembering an unfortunate experience with American missionaries at Mosega, where the Boers had attacked the Matabele, looted the mission station, and taken the missionaries away. However, he agreed to receive the new missionaries, on the condition that his friend Moshete would come too.
I love you,
he said to Moffat.
You are my father. I do not know these new men. Not all men are the same.
Moselekatse was aware that if the teachings of the Bible took hold among his tribe, his claims to divine status would end. His warriors used to honor him by saying,
O Pezulu, King of Kings, King of the heavens, who would not fear before the son of Machobane. His father's name, mighty in battle.
He also suspected that allowing white men to settle in the country would eventually lead to the decline of his and his people's power. But he trusted his friend Romeri, or Moshete, completely. An example of Moffat's influence over this powerful chief is when he convinced Moselekatse to release the heir to the chieftainship of the Bamangwato, a large tribe living at Shoshong, northeast of Sechele's people. After a long discussion, the matter was settled. Machung, the heir who had been held captive for 16 years, was called. Moselekatse said to him,
Machung, man of Moffat, go with your father. We have made arrangements for you. Moffat will take you back to Sechele. That is my wish as well as his, that you should first be returned to the chief from whom you were taken in war. When you were captured, you were a child. I have raised you to be a man.
The impact of Machung's release on the neighboring tribes was immense. This event took place while Moffat was with Moselekatse, organizing the arrival of the new missionaries. When Moffat and Machung reached Sechele's town on their way home, they were greeted by Sechele and other tribal chiefs, who led them to a natural amphitheatre. There, at least 10,000 people, fully equipped for war, had gathered. Sechele called for silence and began the meeting. One speaker after another expressed their joy at seeing the Bamangwato chief return from captivity. One of them said,
Tribes, children of the ancients, today is a day of wonder. Now I begin to see that those who preach truly speak the truth. If Moffat were not of God, he would not have taken up Sechele's cause, listened to him, and delivered Macheng from the place of wild beasts, where we Bekwanas dared not go. Some argue that there is nothing in religion. Let them cast aside their disbelief today. If Moffat were not a man of God, he would not have done what he has done, bringing back one who was lost, who was dead, from the stronghold of the mighty. Moselikatse is a lion. He conquered nations, plundered the strong, bereaved mothers, and took away the son of Keri. We talk of love. What is love? We hear of the love of God. Is it not through the love of God that Macheng is with us today? A stranger from a nation, who among us even knows how far away it is, makes himself one of us, enters the lion's den, and brings back to us our own blood.
When Moffat returned home from his visit to the Matabele, he learned that the Livingstons were preparing to journey to the Zambezi and would stop at the Cape on their way. He also found out that a large group of new missionaries had been assigned to start missions further inland. The Moffats quickly left for the Cape, where they met Dr. and Mrs. Livingston and their companions. Once again, Mary Moffat was reunited with her daughter. Since she had suffered much during the voyage, it was decided that she would join the missionary group and travel overland to the Zambezi. In Cape Town, Moffat had the joy of welcoming his own son, the Reverend John Moffat, who was set to go to the Matabele as a missionary, funded by Dr. Livingston's private resources. Sir George Grey, Her Majesty's High Commissioner, strongly supported the plans to expand Christianity and commerce among the interior tribes. He arranged with Robert Moffat to establish postal communication with the Zambezi through Kuruman. With all the arrangements complete, the missionaries left Cape Town for Kuruman, from where they would continue to their assigned stations with the Makololo and Matabele. However, there were delays. The Boers had attacked some of the Batlapings and threatened the Kuruman station. Road difficulties also prevented some of the group from arriving on time. Eventually, the obstacles were cleared, and thanks to Sir George Grey's intervention, the Boers' resistance to the mission's advance was overcome. On July 7th, 1859, the first group set out for their distant destination. This group included Mr. Helmore, a veteran missionary who had long been stationed at Lekatlong, along with his wife and 4 children, Mr. and Mrs. Price, a native teacher from Lekatlong named Tabor, who chose to accompany his former missionary, and the usual group of native attendants. They were all headed to the Makololo. The situation was serious. The end of their journey was 1,000 miles further into the interior than any of them had ever been, except for 2 native servants who had accompanied Livingston before. But they moved forward in faith, not knowing what lay ahead, but trusting everything to God, who knows even when a sparrow falls to the ground. A week later, Mr. Thomas and John Moffat, with their wives, departed, followed closely by Robert Moffat and Mr. Sykes. At Sekele's town, these 2 groups reunited and continued their journey towards the Matabele. Along the way, some of their oxen fell ill, so when they reached the first outpost of Moselekatse's people, a messenger was sent to the king. The message explained the situation and suggested that the missionaries' oxen be quarantined, while Moselekatse provided his own oxen to bring the party to his headquarters. This proposal was made to avoid linking the arrival of the gospel with the outbreak of disease among the Matabele's cattle, which would have happened if the sick oxen had continued on and infected the local herds. A reply was sent back, saying that the group should continue their journey, and that even if the epidemic spread, they would not be blamed. Moffat sent a second messenger to say that he had heard the king's message and would leave in a couple of days. However, he urged the king to consider the consequences of the epidemic spreading among his thousands of cattle, assuring him that the mission party was extremely concerned about this. The group then continued slowly for 2 or 3 days until they were met by another messenger. This one informed them that Moselekatse appreciated their concern for him and his people and, now fully aware of the danger, wanted all their oxen to return. Warriors were already on their way to pull the mission wagons to the headquarters. Everyone was surprised by the unusual idea, but soon the warriors arrived, fully equipped with shields and spears, along with a number of oxen to be slaughtered for food. After some displays of war tactics, the warriors took the place of the oxen and the journey resumed. There were many strong pulls, long pulls, and pulls together as the wagons moved forward. However, after 10 days of hard struggle and slow progress, it became clear that the men weren't up to the task. Finally, the king, who had mysteriously withheld his oxen, sent them to bring the wagons to his camp. Moselekatse welcomed his old friend warmly, as usual, but it soon became clear that something was wrong. The missionaries' request for a piece of land to establish a mission station was met with all kinds of evasions and delays. Days, weeks, and months passed, during which the missionaries endured great hardships. Finally, the chief broke up his camp and left them stranded, without oxen to pull their wagons. He said he would send people to guide them to the place where they should settle and that he would join them there later. Moselekatse's behavior seemed odd, and Moffat began to suspect that the king regretted allowing the missionaries to settle with him. This suspicion turned out to be correct. The Boers had followed the arrival of missionaries in several instances, which made Moselekatse and his people suspicious. They began to question whether the settlement should be allowed. Finally, the situation improved, the doubts cleared, and the plan moved forward. Oxen were sent to transport the missionary wagons to Inyati, where they would join Moselekatse. Everything was settled, and a suitable spot for the station was chosen. Each of the new missionaries set up his tent under a tree he selected, waiting for a more permanent dwelling to be built. Thus, the Matabele mission was officially established in December 1859. Although the mission was now in place, the work had only just begun. The first 6 months of 1860 were filled with non-stop labour for the missionaries at Inyati. They had to build houses, repair wagons, and prepare garden plots for cultivation. Moffat was constantly at work, whether in the saw pit, at the blacksmith's forge, or at the carpenter's bench, always helping and encouraging his younger colleagues. He also tried to gain Moselekatse's approval to establish regular communication with the Livingstone expedition on the Zambezi through Matabeleland, but the king's suspicious nature thwarted this effort. The isolation of his country in that direction was so severe that, despite being relatively close, no news could be obtained about the other missionary group, led by Mr. Helmore, which had gone to the Makololo tribe. In June 1860, Moffat felt that his work at Inyati was complete. He had given his all, both mentally and physically, to establish the mission, enduring hardships that even younger men might have avoided. The time had come for him to say a final farewell to Moselekatse. Approaching the chief's kraal one last time, Moffat intended to speak to the chief and his people about the crucial matters of life, death, and eternity. The old chief, seated in his large courtyard, welcomed his missionary friend warmly. They sat together, Moselekatse, the feared Matabele ruler, and Moffat, the messenger of the Prince of Peace. The warriors gathered in a semicircle, while the women crept as close as they could, all listening intently to Moshetti's final words. It was a solemn service, marking the end of Moffat's long efforts to reach the hearts of Moselekatse and his people. The next day, Moffat started his journey home, arriving safely after being away for 12 months. Meanwhile, the group that had set out to establish the Makololo mission faced severe trials. The journey to Linyanti was filled with challenges that only the strongest Christian principles could have inspired them to endure. The greatest challenge was the scarcity of water. One trial was described as follows:
From the Zuga, we travelled fairly comfortably until late November, when we suffered greatly from a lack of water. For over a week, every drop we used had to be fetched from about 35 miles away. Mrs. Helmore's feelings can be imagined when, one afternoon, with the temperature at 107 degrees in the shade, she was rationing just one spoonful of water for each of the dear children for the next morning, not even considering taking a drop for herself. Mr. Helmore, along with the men, was away searching for water. When he returned the next morning with the precious fluid, we learned that he had walked a full 40 miles.
After enduring countless difficulties and hardships for 7 months, the mission party finally arrived at Linyanti, where Chief Sekeletu resided. He refused to let them move to a healthier location and insisted they stay with him in the fever-ridden marshes. With no better option, they had to accept. Within a week, everyone in the group was struck down by fever. Little Henry Helmore, his sister, and the infant child of Mr. Price were the first to die, followed by Mrs. Helmore, who was heartbroken by the loss. 6 weeks later, Mr. Helmore also passed away, leaving only Mr. and Mrs. Price and the now orphaned children. To save their lives, the survivors prepared to leave. But Chief Sekeletu put obstacles in their way. Their goods were stolen and their wagon was seized. When Mr. Price told the chief that
if they did not let him go soon, they would have to bury him beside the others,
the chief coldly replied,
"You might as well die here as anywhere else."
Eventually, they were allowed to take a few belongings and began their sorrowful journey home, with Mr. Price very ill and his wife unable to use her feet and legs. They faced a journey of over 1,000 miles back to Kuruman, with the bare minimum of supplies. Just as they started to feel a glimmer of hope and consider renewed efforts for the Lord, Mrs. Price passed away.
"My dear wife,"
wrote the grieving husband,
"had been utterly helpless for a long time, but we all thought she was getting better. One morning, I found her breathing very hard. She went to sleep that night, only to never wake again. I tried to wake her, but it was too late. I watched her all morning as she worsened, and a little after midday, her spirit left for God. I buried her that same evening under a tree, the only tree on the vast plain of Mahabe. This is a heavy blow, but God is my refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble."
Eventually, Meister Price was met by Mr. and Mrs. Mackenzie, who were on their way to join the Makololo mission. Together they began the journey back to Kuruman. They were relieved when they encountered Robert Moffat, who, after hearing of the disaster and learning that Mr. Price and the remaining party were on the road, had gone out to find them. All of them returned to Kuruman in sorrow, and the ill-fated Makololo mission came to an end. Robert Moffat and his wife Mary closely followed the progress of the mission at Inyati with great interest. It reminded them of their early days at Lattakoo. Their hearts were deeply invested in the work of the missionaries at that distant station. Not only because of their strong desire to see God's work flourish among the uncivilized natives, but also because their son, John Moffat, and his wife were part of the Matabele mission. They sent post bags and supplies whenever possible, along with warm words of encouragement and sympathy from their home in Kuruman, which motivated the distant workers to continue their labor for the Lord. Kuruman served as a central home station for all the interior missionaries. Being an interior missionary was enough to guarantee any travel-worn stranger or friend a warm welcome and good hospitality for weeks. Robert and Mary Moffat, who had carried the heavy burdens of mission work for many years, offered deep sympathy, heartfelt support, and earnest prayers for the missionaries and their work. In October 1861, their daughter Bessie, who was born on a ship in Table Bay as they were leaving for their first visit to England, married Mr. R. Price. Mr. Price's previous wife had died the year before during the terrible journey from Linyanti, when the Makololo mission had to be abandoned. As one missionary fell, Another stepped forward to take their place and continue the important work for the Lord, who commanded, "Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature." The Prices went to Shoshong for a time, hoping to join the Makaba mission, but eventually worked among the Bakwena under Chief Sekela, while the Kuruman station itself was a hub of constant activity. A revision of the New Testament was underway. The youngest Miss Moffat, the only child still at home, was busy with schools and classes, and Mr. Ashton had resumed his work alongside his old colleague, Robert Moffat. The year 1862 brought deep sorrow to the Moffats. During a journey to Durban, in Natal, their eldest son, Robert Moffat, passed away, leaving behind a wife and 4 children. He had been preparing to bring them from Durban to the home he had set up at Kuruman. Originally intended to be a missionary, Robert had been sent to England for education, but due to failing health, he had to return to South Africa. There, he worked for a time in the survey department under the government and later became a trader. He was highly respected and had earned the full trust of the native people. Few weeks later, more heartbreaking news reached the grieving parents. Their eldest daughter, Mary, the wife of Dr. Livingston, had passed away on the Zambezi. A white marble cross near Shupanga House on the Shire River now marks the resting place of this devoted woman who gave her life for the cause of Africa's regeneration. The following year, Robert Moffat received word that William Ross, the missionary at Lattakoo, about 80 miles to the southeast, was seriously ill. Moffat quickly set out and arrived in time to find his friend still alive. He did all he could to ease his suffering, but William Ross soon passed away. This sorrowful event led to Mr. Ashton being transferred to Lattakoo, leaving the full burden of duties at Kuruman on Moffat's shoulders for a time. Though often in danger, Robert Moffat had never before faced personal violence from a native. However, he now narrowly escaped death. A young man who had been living at the station showed signs of a disturbed mind and was placed under mild restraint. Harbouring a violent hatred toward Moffat, he attacked the missionary as he was returning from church, striking him with a knobbed stick and inflicting severe blows. Frightened by his own actions, the young man fled. Had Moffat been less physically strong, the outcome could have been much worse. As it was, he recovered, though deeply saddened by the incident. In 1865, the mission received reinforcements with the arrival of Reverend John Brown from England and the return of John Moffat from the Matabele. This allowed Robert Moffat some relief from the station's active duties, which he used to focus on revising scripture, preparing additional hymns, and overseeing the publication of smaller works. Earlier, their second daughter Anne had married Jean Frédou, a missionary with the Paris Evangelical Society, stationed at Motito, about 36 miles northeast of Kuruman. Frédou was a gentle and studious man. In early March 1866, he set out on a tour to conduct evangelistic work among the Baralong villages along the edge of the Kalahari Desert. During his visit to one of these villages, a low-class trader arrived. Known for his atrocious conduct at Motito, the natives insisted that the trader go to Kuruman to face an investigation. When he refused, they prepared to take him by force. The trader fortified himself in his wagon, loaded all his guns, and dared anyone to approach him. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, Frédou quietly approached the trader's wagon and urged him to go peacefully to Kuruman, warning him that the people were determined to take him there, either peacefully or by force. While Jean Frédou was pleading with the trader, a devastating explosion occurred. The wagon, along with its occupant, was blown to pieces. Jean Frédou, along with 12 natives, were killed, and about 30 more were injured. This tragedy brought yet another heavy blow to Robert Moffat and his wife. Upon hearing of the disaster, Robert immediately went to comfort his widowed daughter and to bury the shattered remains of his son-in-law at Motito. Few months later, Robert Moffat returned to the grave at Motito, this time to bury Mrs. Brown, the wife of Reverend John Brown, who had recently joined him at Kuruman as a colleague. By 1868, the missionary team at Kuruman consisted of Robert Moffat and his son, John. Robert, now over 70 years old, began to feel the effects of age more acutely. Unlike the biblical Moses, whose eye was not dim, nor his natural force abated, Moffat found that the infirmities of age were rapidly overtaking him. He pressed on for 2 more years, but a persistent cough during the winter worsened his tendency towards sleeplessness. Finally, he reluctantly accepted the director's invitation to return permanently to England. For Moffat, returning to England could hardly be called going home. His true home was among the Bechuanas, the people for whom he had laboured and prayed for so long. The ashes of his son Robert and his beloved daughter Mary rested beneath the sands of Africa. His entire adult life had been spent under its scorching sun. The house he was leaving had been the birthplace of most of his children and his home for over 40 years. It was painfully difficult to leave, especially as he had always expected that he and his faithful wife would be laid to rest side by side in the little burial ground at Kuruman, marked by a few trees in a bushy dell. But the decision had been made, and with slow, hesitant steps, as though hoping for something to delay their departure even then, preparations were made to leave the station forever. Reverend John Moffat provided a vivid description of the activities at Kuruman during the last 2 years of his father's time there, in a letter to the directors dated October 12, 1868.
At the station, our public services include a prayer meeting at sunrise on Sunday, along with 3 preaching services in Sechwana, morning, afternoon, and evening, and the Sunday school held twice, followed by a juvenile afternoon service. The early prayer meeting is entirely managed by the natives, while my father and I handle the preaching services. The Sunday school and juvenile service are led by my sister. We also have a Wednesday evening service, a monthly missionary prayer meeting, a church meeting, and a prayer meeting on Thursday afternoon, which is also managed by the natives. Native preachers at the station, except in rare cases when it's seen as a temporary solution. My father and I share the preaching duties. Occasionally, about once every 3 weeks, one of us rides out to 2 nearby villages to the northwest, where we hold services. These villages are 8 and 12 miles away, respectively. At home, my usual routine involves a New Testament reading in the morning, a topical sermon in the afternoon, and an Old Testament exposition in the evening. On Monday evenings, I lead a young men's Bible class, which is particularly meaningful to me, as I find much encouragement in it. On Monday evenings, my sister and I also hold a practice session to improve the singing. On Tuesday evenings, I meet with male inquirers. On Wednesday, before the evening service, I lead a Bible class for women. On Thursday, we have an English prayer meeting. And on Friday evenings, I meet with female inquirers. I should also mention the school run by my sister with the help of 3 native assistants.
Speaking of the place and people, he continues,
The population is small and spread out. There are quite a few people living in the area itself and in the villages to the northwest, but most of the district only has small villages with 20 to 100 huts. The district stretches about 50 miles to the west and northwest, and about 25 miles in other directions. The people are poor and will likely stay that way. The land is mostly dry, so irrigation is needed for farming, but there are few places with flowing water. There's no market for cattle, even if they could thrive, which they don't. I doubt there will be much progress in civilization here, because resources are so limited, and European trade is based on huge profits and losses. Charging 200% more than Port Elizabeth prices is seen as normal. Heathenism, as a system, is weak, and in many places it hardly exists. Christianity faces little opposition. The people are generally devoted Bible readers, churchgoers, and hymn singers, though I fear many do so without real understanding. For them, religion mostly means these activities and giving money to the auxiliary. I'm speaking of the majority, though there are some who seem to be true Christians, though dimly. This isn't just due to a lack of intelligence. The Bechuanas show sharpness when needed. The mission's educational work has been neglected. At this station, young people, after leaving school, have regressed because there's no further education available. The village schoolmasters, who are uneducated themselves and mostly unpaid, have little impact. It's amazing they achieve anything at all, and that we even have readers. The older missionaries couldn't have done much differently. Every day I'm troubled by the lack of qualified native schoolmasters and teachers, and I keep wondering how they can be trained.
On Sunday, March 20th, 1870, Robert Moffat preached for the last time in the Kuruman church, and that Friday, he and his wife left. Ramari and Mamari, as Mr. and Mrs. Moffat were called, had won the hearts of the natives. For weeks, farewell messages had been coming from distant towns and villages. When the final moment came, and the elderly missionary, with his long white beard and his equally respected wife, left their house and walked to their wagon, crowds gathered. Each person longed for one last handshake, a final word, or one last look. As the wagon drove away, a long, sorrowful cry rose from those who realized their teacher and friend was gone. After a rough but safe journey of 8 weeks, Robert and Mary Moffat reached Port Elizabeth on May 20th, 1870, where they were warmly welcomed by many missionaries and Christian friends. After a short stay, they boarded the mail steamer Roman and landed in Cape Town on June 2nd. There they were honoured by the Christian community with a public breakfast. A few days later, they set sail on the steamship Norseman, headed for England. Chapter 10. Closing Scenes. In the March 1870 edition of the Chronicle of the London Missionary Society, the following announcement was made.
Our readers will be glad to hear that there is now a definite prospect of welcoming back to England our veteran missionary, the Reverend Robert Moffat. He is expected to arrive with Mrs. Moffat around June. Mr. Moffat no longer enjoys the robust health he once had. In his last letter, he wrote,
"What used to be a small task for me now feels like a huge challenge, and for some time now, both of us have begun to feel the labour and sorrow that often come to those who have passed 70 years of age."
The Norseman ship reached Plymouth on July 24th, and the next day Robert and Mary Moffat arrived in Southampton. This marked their return to their homeland, where they would stay for good after being away for over 50 years, with only one previous visit. During that time, on August 1st, he was welcomed by the Missionary Society at a significant meeting held in the boardroom of the Mission House on Blomfield Street. During that meeting, Moffat reflected on his earlier visit in 1839 and the printing of the New Testament in Sechwana. He shared,
"When I first came to the Cape, before my initial visit, I brought with me a translation of the New Testament, which I had completed under challenging circumstances. Part of my day was spent roofing a large church, and the rest was dedicated to studying and consulting concordances. I was eager to have it printed, so I brought it to the Cape, but I couldn't find any printing office willing to take on the job. The committee of the Bible Society, who have always been very supportive, something I say with pleasure, sent paper and ink to the Cape, expecting I would get the work done there. However, as I mentioned, there was no printing office willing to do it. While dining with Sir George Napier, the governor, I told him about the problem. He said,
"Just hop on a ship with your translation, get it printed in England, and you'll be back before they even start thinking about it here. Printing a New Testament among a group of Dutch printers. I can't even get my proclamations printed."
I responded by saying, "I've become too unfamiliar with the civilized world. I've almost forgotten my own language. I'd be nervous to go there."
"Nonsense."
A while later, he saw me in the street and asked,
"Well, Moffat, what have you decided?"
I told him I was waiting for Dr. Phillips' return.
"Don't wait for anyone, just jump on a ship. Think about how important it is to get the New Testament printed in a new language."
He invited me to dinner again and asked,
"Have you made up your mind? I wish I could give you mine. I have some interest in spreading the knowledge of the Word of God. Don't take anyone's advice. Just get on a ship to England."
He was so serious that I began to take the idea seriously myself. Dr. Philip arrived, and when the governor explained the situation, the doctor said,
"Go, by all means."
I felt nervous at the thought. I hadn't been nervous in Africa. I could sleep through the roar of lions. But the idea of meeting so many important people made me anxious. Eventually, I came to England and got over it.
The following Wednesday after the meeting, he was honoured with a public breakfast at the Cannon Street Hotel. For a few weeks, the Moffats stayed in Canonbury, though Robert was often travelling to different parts of the country, including Edinburgh, where he reunited with many old friends. He didn't stay long in any one place during this time. They spent the winter in Brixton, and on December 21st, Robert Moffat was presented with £1,000 as a birthday gift, a heartfelt tribute to a faithful servant of Jesus Christ. Not long after this kind gesture, tragedy struck the home in Brixton. The woman who had been Robert's loving companion for over 50 years, sharing in his joys, struggles, and dangers, was dying. A persistent cough, difficulty breathing, a few deep breaths, and she quietly passed away without even a final farewell. Called home to hear the words, "Well done, good and faithful servant," and to enter into her Lord's joy. Her last prayer was for her husband, that he would have strength to endure the loss. But Moffat indeed needed strength in this moment of grief. His first words upon realizing she was gone were,
"For 53 years I have had her to pray for me."
In a letter to his old friend and fellow labourer, Roger Edwards, in Port Elizabeth, he wrote,
"How lonely I feel, and if it were not for Jeannie,"
his daughter,
"it would be even worse."
The following years were filled with travel. He visited various parts of the country, including Highley, Dukinfield, and Caronshaw. He was in constant demand for missionary meetings. Many readers might still remember his weathered face, full white beard, sharp eyes, and dignified presence during this time, as well as the joy of hearing his passionate descriptions of Africa's needs. He spent the winter of 1871 in Ventnor on the Isle of Wight, working on revisions for the Sechwana Old Testament. While there, at the Queen's request, he was introduced to Her Majesty, whom he had never met before. He also received an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree from the University of Edinburgh. To meet the need for training a native ministry, a concern that Moffat and others involved in the Bechuana mission had long shared, and had recently brought to the attention of the directors, several £1,000s were donated. To honour the veteran missionary who was now among them, it was proposed to name the new institute the Moffat Institute. This institute now stands as a centre of influence among the tribes near the Kuruman station. In 1873, a group of friends who felt that the generous contributions to the institute didn't fully express their admiration for Moffat presented him with over £5,000. This generous gift ensured that Moffat's needs were met for the rest of his life, allowing him to continue serving the directors and the mission cause without being a financial burden on the society. It also enabled him to support his widowed daughter and her fatherless children. While living in Brixton, Robert Moffat attended the ministry of the late Reverend Baldwin Brown and took a keen interest in his mission work in Lambeth. On his 80th birthday, December 21st, 1875, he opened the new mission hall associated with this work, which was thereafter named in his honour. On the same day, he received numerous congratulatory messages, including an address signed by many congregational ministers from across the country. Earlier that same year, he had lectured on missions at Westminster Abbey, and the previous year, he had carried out the sad task of identifying the remains of his son-in-law, Dr. Livingstone, when they were brought back from Africa. Despite his advancing age, Moffat's schedule remained full due to the many requests for his services. He often remarked,
"People either could not or would not see that I was getting old."
But they knew that as long as he had the strength, he wouldn't tire of speaking about missionary work. In 1876, he dined with the Archbishop of Canterbury at Lambeth Palace on one occasion and had breakfast with Mr. Gladstone at the home of Reverend Newman Hall on another. The following year, he accepted an invitation from the French Missionary Society to visit Paris, where he addressed a gathering of 4,000 Sunday school children. On December 20th, 1878, Robert Moffat was awarded the Freedom of the City of London. A little over 2 years later, he was a guest of the Lord Mayor, Alderman Sir William MacArthur, for several days, during which a banquet was held in his honour. While Cetshwayo, the Zulu king, was in England, Moffat took a keen interest in him and paid him a visit. Among Cetshwayo's attendants was a man who spoke Sechwana, and Moffat quickly struck up a conversation with him. The man's delight was immense. He had been in the service of a son of Moselekatse and had heard of the missionary.
"Are you Moffat?"
he asked repeatedly, his eyes shining with excitement. When he was convinced, he exclaimed,
"I see today what my eyes never expected to behold, Moffat."
In the last 4 years of his life, Robert Moffat lived at Park Cottage in Lee, near Tunbridge, where he was a tenant of the late Samuel Morley. Both Mr. and Mrs. Morley showed him great kindness, which continued until his death. The end of his life was approaching. In 1883, Moffat began to complain of extreme fatigue and irregular heartbeats. This troubled him so much that medical advice was sought, which helped for a short time. He attended the Bible Society's meeting in the second week of May and the London Missionary Society's meeting on the 10th. In July, he visited Knockholt, where he met Mr. and Mrs. George Sturge. After returning from this visit, he seemed to improve, but within a few days his condition worsened again. Despite his declining health, his strong body, which had endured so much over the years, resisted giving up. Whenever he felt able, he spent time in his garden and even managed to take 2 short drives, with Mrs. Morley kindly providing her carriage. Mark the perfect man and behold the upright, for the end of that man is peace. This verse beautifully reflects the closing scenes of Robert Moffat's life. On Sunday, August 5th, he was too weak to attend chapel and spent a peaceful day at home. He loved hymns and often repeated them. That evening he selected several hymns to be sung, although his weakness prevented him from joining in. Among his choices were "The Sands of Time Are Sinking," "Come, Thou Fount of Every Blessing," "How Sweet the Name of Jesus Sounds," and "Nearer, My God, to Thee." His New Testament was his constant companion during these final days, and no matter the topic of conversation, it always turned to heaven and the Saviour. On Monday he seemed somewhat better, but by Tuesday night his condition had worsened. He endured hours of pain and sleeplessness, yet on Wednesday he rose and went out to the garden several times. In the evening he became very ill and had a fainting spell. Despite this, he managed to get upstairs, and after sitting on the bedside for some time, propped up with pillows, he undressed with little assistance. With a cold, trembling hand, he wound up his watch, saying,
"For the last time."
The doctor arrived shortly after and discovered that Moffat had ruptured a blood vessel. The night was spent partly in peaceful sleep and partly in conversation with his children who were present. His daughter later remarked,
"He was just full of his Saviour's love and mercy all through his life. He repeated many hymns and passages of Scripture."
On Thursday morning, Mr. Morley and 2 other friends visited Robert Moffat. He conversed with them and held his testament, but finding he couldn't read it, his daughters read to him instead. He recited many hymns, including the Scottish version of the 103rd Psalm, but then paused and said,
"There is nothing like the original,"
which was then read from the Bible. He also requested his mother's favourite hymn,
"Hail, Sovereign Light,"
to be read to him. After another sleep, he gave a wandering, perhaps unconscious, look at his children, followed by a brief struggle, and then a calmness as his journey ended. His spirit departed to be with the Lord he had loved and served so faithfully. His end was peace. But Moffat died on August 10th, 1883, at the age of 87. His funeral took place a few days later at Norwood Cemetery. Surrounded by relatives in England, Sir Bartle Frere, Mr. Samuel Morley, Several members of Parliament, delegations from various missionary and religious societies, and the mayor of Bloemfontein, his remains were laid to rest. True hero was carried to the grave that day, one fully deserving of the title of man. Chapter 11. Conclusion. When it became clear that Robert Moffat had truly passed away, there was a widespread sense that a great man had left us. A place in the hall of true human greatness seemed vacant. This sentiment was echoed by several leading journals, which published articles praising his life, work, and character. The Times offered the following reflection.
His main work was among the Bechuanas. The transformation of these people under his influence is remarkable. The Bechuanas he first encountered would hardly be recognized today, so profound has been their change under the new influences that Moffat was the first to introduce. He found them as mere savages, constantly at war with each other and their neighbors, ignorant of agriculture and in a deeply degraded state, similar to what we now see in more remote tribes untouched by civilization. His first priority was to master their language. For 50 years, he spoke the Bechuana tongue, developed a written form of it, and translated the scriptures into it. Under Moffat's leadership, the Bechuanas became new people. Missionary work flourished among them, with others continuing what Moffat had started. A permanent group of native pastors arose from among the Bechuanas themselves, and the entire region, once savage, became significantly civilized and Christianized. It seems that only through the efforts of men like Moffat can the interaction between the white and black races be anything but harmful to the latter. The missionary alone seeks nothing for himself. He chooses a life of selflessness. If he receives honor, it is not by his own design, but as an unsought tribute from others. Robert Moffat has passed away, full of years and honors. His work laid the foundations of the church in central South Africa. Wherever his influence, and that of his colleagues and successors, has reached, it has brought nothing but good. His name will be remembered as long as the South African church exists, and his example will inspire others as a lasting proof of what a Christian missionary can achieve.
The Brighton Daily News began its article with these words.
The grave has just closed over one of the most notable men familiar to the inhabitants of Brighton. Robert Moffat, the veteran pioneer in the mission field and the simplest of heroes, has passed away, and many of the noblest in the land followed his remains to their resting place.
The article concluded with,
In the drawing rooms of fashionable Brighton, crowded with lovers of art and science, no one resented the interruption of the most classical music or the most charming conversation to listen to the venerable doctor when he was asked to share some incidents from his missionary life. Everyone felt that the occasion was made sacred by the presence of someone who had done a work for the good of humanity that few are privileged to accomplish. Robert Moffat belonged to no sect or party. His sole purpose was to improve the world and advance the one church.
Other journals and magazines similarly praised his worth. Much has already been said in these pages about his work and its outcomes. To this, we can add Robert Moffat's own account of some of the benefits that arose from the missionary efforts in South Africa. In his speech at Port Elizabeth, just before leaving for England in May 1870, he reflected on the general progress made in the interior, saying,
Christianity has already accomplished much in this long darkened land. When I first arrived at Kuruman, few people dared to travel beyond it. Now they journey safely to the Zambezi. Back then, we were strangers, and the people couldn't understand us. They treated us with great disrespect, considering us outcasts from our own society who had come to live with them. But remembering what our Saviour endured, we were encouraged to persevere, and our efforts have been greatly rewarded. Now it is safe to travel anywhere in the country, and traders go far beyond Kuruman without any fear of harm. In the past, people from one tribe couldn't safely travel through another tribe's territory, and wars were frequent. During my early mission work, I often heard of men from one tribe being murdered while trying to trade with another. I was at a native settlement when such an event occurred. A group of men had travelled 200 miles to trade, but the local people, disliking them, attacked and killed 2 of them. When I asked why they did this and explained it was wrong, they seemed to understand. From that time on, I never heard of anything like it happening again. The influence of Christianity in that country is now very strong and continues to grow. Where one station was barely tolerated, there are now several. The Moravians have their missionaries, the Berlin Society has theirs, and others are also engaged in this good work, along with numerous native gospel teachers. Our advanced station at the Matabele is thriving, and I fully expect that the Matabele will one day become a great nation. They strictly follow their own laws, and I've noticed that when people with firm principles embrace the great truths of Christianity, they hold on to their faith steadfastly, and their loyalty is not easily shaken.
In the same speech, Robert Moffat mentioned that at first the natives wouldn't buy anything, not even a pocket handkerchief. But by the time he was speaking, no less than £60,000 worth of British goods were being traded annually among the native tribes around Kuruman. Thus, the missionary paved the way for the merchant, and the gospel laid the foundation for the advancement of civilization. We've had several glimpses of Moffat's character throughout these pages, and his personal appearance and dignified bearing are somewhat captured in his portraits and pictures. However, a few more words can be added, based on the observations recorded by his son in the final chapter of Robert and Mary Moffat. Moffat was tall and strong, with dark, piercing eyes. He was a man of unwavering courage, quick and energetic in action, with a sense of duty that no opposition could deter. Yet, despite his strength and determination, he was gentle in manner and had an even temper, unshaken by the many challenges he faced. He naturally thought well of people and believed in what they said. He had a deep hatred for deceit, which was the one thing he found unforgivable. His trust in people was absolute, and this likely explains why the Bechuanas, who were known for their skill in lying, rarely lied to him. They knew it was the one thing that would anger him. Moffat had a profound reverence for holy things. He enjoyed a good joke and had a strong sense of humour, but he would not tolerate anyone speaking lightly about matters related to God. To him, the word of the Lord was too real and too important for any triviality. God was ever present in his life, and he lived entirely for God. His son recalls,
"Even when I was alone with him on some of his itinerating journeys, no meal began without a reverent removal of the Scotch bonnet, his usual headgear in those days, and a solemn blessing, and our morning and evening worship was never missed or hurried."
An example of Robert Moffat's patience in the face of provocation is given in the following account.
On our return from England in 1843,
the writer notes,
we were a large group with 3 or 4 wagons. One night, we set up camp in the dark, unaware that we were on forbidden ground within the boundaries of a farm, but about half a mile from the homestead. Early the next morning, a young man rode up and demanded to know why we were there without permission. My father calmly explained that it was an innocent mistake, but before he could finish, the young man launched into a loud and lengthy tirade. The youth sat on his horse, while my father stood before him, with his head bowed and arms folded, enduring a torrent of abuse mixed with the sharp and biting invective that the South African Dutch language is known for. We, his children, stood nearby and couldn't help but recall that only a few months earlier, this same man, now being berated like a dog, had stood before thousands in England who listened to him with rapt attention. Something must have caused the young man to feel ashamed, for he suddenly rode off without seizing our cattle, as he had threatened. We packed up and moved on, stopping by the farmhouse on our way. To our surprise and relief, we were welcomed with open arms by an elderly farmer and his wife, who turned out to be old friends of my parents. We were very glad that nothing had been done on our part to make us ashamed to meet them.
At home, Moffat was a true father, and the atmosphere that surrounded his children must have been a joyful one, as many of them embraced the missionary calling and followed in their parents' footsteps. Mary, the eldest daughter, married Dr. Livingstone. Anne married the French missionary Jean Fredu. Bessie, a younger daughter, married the Reverend Roger Price, and a son, the Reverend John Moffat, became his father's co-worker at the Kuruman station for a time. As we conclude this memoir, it's fitting to take a brief look at South Africa as it is now, and note some of the contrasts between its current state and what it was before Robert Moffat's arrival, as described in our opening chapter. When Robert Moffat first arrived in Cape Town, the work of evangelizing the indigenous peoples was primarily carried out by two organizations, the Moravian Mission and the London Missionary Society. Today, there are more than 12 missionary societies active in the region, representing various nationalities, including English, American, French, Swiss, Norwegian, and Finnish. The Moravian Brethren were among the earliest to begin their work, focusing mainly on the Hottentots and Kaffirs. Their central station is Genedendal, located 80 miles east of Cape Town, surrounded by several smaller stations. Further east, among the Kaffir tribes, is the Shiloh Station, which also has a number of outposts. The London Missionary Society follows with 11 main stations and 9 outstations. This society is active in South Africa, Kaffirland, Bechuanaland and Matabeleland. According to the 1886 report, there are 16 English missionaries and 65 native preachers working in these regions, with 1,361 church members recorded. However, these numbers are incomplete, and the progress of missionary work has been significantly hampered by the many wars and the unstable conditions in the country. Next is the Wesleyan Missionary Society, which began its work in Cape Town in 1814 and expanded its stations along the coast from Little Namaqualand to Zululand. They also have missions among the Baralongs in the Orange Free State, in Swaziland, and at the Gold Fields in Barberton, Transvaal. The Scottish Presbyterians are represented by the missions of the Free Church of Scotland and the United Presbyterian Church. Their efforts are mainly concentrated in British Kaffraria and Kaffirland. The Free Church operates a high-class institution at Lovedale, dedicated to training a native ministry and teaching the natives various useful arts, including an improved system of agriculture. The institution has a capable staff of teachers, and in 1885 it had 380 pupils, of whom 71 were church members and 91 were candidates or inquirers. A similar institution has also been established among the Fingos at Blytheswood in Fingoland. More than 50 years ago, at the suggestion of Dr. Philip, the Rhenish Mission began its work among the Hottentots of Cape Colony. Over time, its operations expanded to include Little and Great Namaqualand, both south and north of the Orange River, and further into the territory known as Damaraland. The mission's stations are thriving, with around 15,000 converts attesting to the success of their efforts. This society also focuses on preparing native teachers and has an excellent institution for this purpose located at Worcester, near Cape Town, which is their principal station. Farther north, beyond Damaraland, lies Ovamboland, where the Missionary Society of Finland has established its work. 7 ordained missionaries and 3 Christian artisans were sent to this region, based on a suggestion from the Rhenish Society. Since this mission is relatively new, the results have not yet been fully realized, but the positive influence they exert will likely bear fruit in time. The Berlin Society's missions stretch from the eastern part of Cape Colony to the Transvaal, also covering the Orange Free State and the Diamond Fields. They have over 7,000 converts and many children receiving education in various schools. Basutoland, located to the east of the Orange Free State, is served by the French Evangelical Missionary Society, which began its work in South Africa in 1829. Their first missionaries were sent to the Bahurutse, who were then subjects of Moselekatse. However, due to Moselekatse's jealousy, they were forced to relocate to Motito and eventually accepted an invitation from Moshesh, the chief of the Basutos, to work among his people. This mission now operates 14 main stations and 66 outstations, with approximately 20,000 adherents, of whom about 3,500 are church members. In 1835, 6 missionaries appointed by the American Board of Foreign Missions arrived from the United States to work in South Africa. 3 of them proceeded to Natal and settled near Durban, while the other 3 travelled to Moselekatse at Mosega. However, their mission was disrupted by Boer incursions, forcing them to flee to Natal. Although the mission in Natal faced significant challenges due to ongoing wars, it eventually became firmly established. Today, it carries out excellent work in both religious and educational spheres, with a well-trained group of native pastors and teachers, in addition to a team of European missionaries. According to the 1886 report, the board oversees 7 main stations and 17 outstations, with a total of 886 church members connected to this mission. The Society for the Propagation of the Gospel began its missions in South Africa in 1838. Its work is divided between serving the colonists and the native population, with efforts concentrated in Cape Colony and Natal. The Society's dioceses extend along the coast in a pattern similar to that of the Wesleyan stations. In addition to these, several other missionary societies are active in South Africa. The Norwegian Missionary Society operates in Natal and Zululand. The Hermannsburg Mission, founded by Pastor Harms, works in Natal, Zululand, and the Transvaal. And the Swiss Mission of the Free Church of the Canton de Vaud focuses on a tribe living in the region between Delagoa Bay and Sofala. Thus, despite the many challenges it faced, the missionary cause has grown significantly, and now the gospel is heard throughout the land. From the southernmost part of what was once called the Dark Continent, but is now referred to by some as the Twilight Continent, a land we hope will soon be fully blessed with the light of Christianity. There stretches a network of mission stations all the way to the Zambezi River. These stations connect with the Central African missions, spreading the message of salvation to the Great Lake, Victoria Nyanza, in the north, eastward to the coast, and westward to thousands through the various organizations doing excellent work along the Congo River. In the heart of South Africa, Kuruman, the site of Robert Moffat's many trials and triumphs, stands today surrounded by numerous native towns and villages. Here, native teachers trained at the Moffat Institute are stationed, and native churches have been established, a beacon of light that dispels the darkness, leading the heathen to the knowledge of the Saviour Jesus Christ. You have finished listening to Robert Moffat,
the missionary hero of Kuruman.
Written by David J. Dean. Originally published in 1880, slightly revised in 2024. Audiobook produced by scrollreader.com, reviving classical Christian books and missionary biographies with free audiobooks and reformatted reprints.